Harper Audio presents Expedition Whydah by Barry Clifford and Paul Perry, read by Barry Clifford. I spent much of my childhood following my Uncle Bill around Cape Cod. He was a child at heart and didn't mind having me as a constant companion. My mother said that he had money and smarts, but I liked him because he never acted as though he had too much of either. Bill was a Cape native who made a living doing a little bit of everything, from fishing to carpentry, and I learned a lot by just being with him. The times I enjoyed most, though, were spent talking in the fishing shack. Uncle Bill's shack was an escape from reality. It was a weathered wood structure that leaned from the weight of the honeysuckle vines. Inside were boxes of tools, a couple of chairs, and a pile of ancient fishing nets that gave off heat as it rotted away to nothing in the hot sun. It was there, as I lay on the nets, that I first heard the tale of Black Sam Bellamy and Maria Hallett. I was maybe 9 years old. Did you know the Cape was teeming with pirates in the 1700s, he asked? Visions of treasure chests being hauled ashore by swarthy and dangerous men flashed through my mind. I wanted to hear more. It's true, he said, looking at me matter-of-factly. In the 1700s, there was hardly anyone living on the Cape, just a few hardy souls. It was a perfect place for pirates and all other types of misfits and outcasts to live. Uncle Bill lit up an unfiltered Camel cigarette and filled the room with a cloud of smoke that looked like salt haze. He thought a moment and then sat down in one of the creaky chairs. The legend of Black Sam Bellamy and his lover Maria Hallett, he said, is the story that has captivated people for hundreds of years because it is about love, pirates, a shipwreck, and buried treasure. Best of all, it's true. Bill took another drag and eyed me through the cigarette smoke that poured from his mouth. The veil of smoke was creepy to me because I could see human shapes in it, the way some people see faces in cumulus clouds. I conjured images of pirates from the smoke and held my breath as Uncle Bill took me back in time. Bellamy was from the bottom rungs of English society, the abused class. His mother had died when he was born, and he had probably been out of the house and working hard at the age of 10. I guess Bellamy finally had enough of the English class system and left for America to get a fresh start. Legend says he arrived in Cape Cod in 1714 when he was 24 years old. He had relatives here and moved in with them long enough to get on his feet. During this period, he met the two people who would change his life. One of these people was Palsgrave Williams, the jeweler who would lend him money necessary to buy a ship. The second was Maria Hallett, the woman he would love until the day he died. Maria was a beautiful woman, with long hair the color of straw, and eyes as deep and blue as a freshwater pond. Sam met her on a perfect June day as he was walking past the cemetery in the town of Wellfleet. Legend says she was sitting underneath an apple tree covered by a white mist of apple blossoms. He slowed and then stopped. Wherever he was going no longer was important. He had to meet this girl. Bellamy introduced himself, and soon the two were talking like old friends. Maria was only 16 and excited by the worldly stories that this young English sailor told her. He talked of going to sea in his teenage years to work in Queen Anne's merchant fleet, and how thousands of seamen had been laid off because the war with the Spanish had ended and the size of the Navy was cut back. He told her of his hopes and dreams in the colonies, where a man could work his way to success instead of just work himself to death. Then he told her of another plan, a plan to get rich. A dozen Spanish ships loaded with chests of gold and silver had sunk in a storm near Florida, where wrecks were supposedly in shallow water, and rumor had it that the gold was available to anyone who could beat the Spanish to the spot. Maria liked what she saw in Bellamy. He was cocky and not ashamed of being poor. He was confident and seemed to be driven to succeed, and Maria liked those qualities. She wanted to see more of this forthcoming young man. Maria's parents were not happy with their daughter's new friend. They were successful farmers with high hopes for their beautiful daughter. Still, against her parents' wishes, Maria continued to see Sam Bellamy. He spent a lot of time at the Great Island Tavern, an establishment that was more than a tavern. Located on an island about 2 miles from Wellfleet, the Great Island Tavern was difficult for many customers to reach. In reality, the tavern was a temporary warehouse for stolen or smuggled merchandise. Bellamy frequented the tavern with his uncle, Israel Cole. Eventually, Maria became a visitor to the remote outpost, too. Bellamy and Maria spent their days helping the tavern's owner conduct the bustling business of buying and selling black market goods. When they weren't busy in the tavern, Bellamy and Maria shared their thoughts and feelings in the deep green of the forest that covered Great Island. This was a place of solitude, one where a couple could be alone among the trees and tall grass and indulge in romance on a mattress of soft and mossy ground. It wasn't long before Maria was pregnant with Sam Bellamy's child. Suddenly, Bellamy had a more urgent need for money. Through his uncle, Bellamy approached Palsgrave Williams for money to buy a ship and head for the sunken Spanish treasure fleet in Florida. Williams was a jeweler, and jewelers played the role of bankers in these early days of colonial America. Williams purchased a sloop that could make the lengthy trip to Florida and even decided to become Bellamy's quartermaster. With a crew of 30 men, Bellamy sailed south to search for sunken treasure. Before leaving, he promised Maria he would return with a ship filled with gold. That was not to be. By the time Bellamy reached Florida, the gold was gone. The highly efficient Spaniards had hired local Indian divers to recover the treasure. The only thing left for Bellamy and his crew was to retrieve what they could by dragging the area with grapnel hooks. With great care, Bellamy explained the options to his crew. On one hand, they could return to New England with nothing to show for their efforts. That would subject them to a life of hard work and poverty, since all on board had now gone into debt to make this long run for gold. On the other hand, they could go on the account, as becoming a pirate was called, and become looters of nations. To do that, they needed only to hoist the black flag that Bellamy now held in his hands. This flag represents not death, but resurrection, Bellamy told his crew. Never again will you be captives of the wealthy. From this day, we are new men, free men. The vote in favor of becoming pirates was almost unanimous. Bellamy and Williams decided to serve under Benjamin Hornigold, a great teacher of the pirate arts who had just one flaw as far as Bellamy was concerned. He would not attack British ships. This was not a sentiment shared by most of the pirates. They were an international crew that included British as well as French, Spanish, Dutch, and others. As was the custom among pirates, they had discussed their feelings openly and then held a democratic election for a new captain. 90 of the crew members voted to make Bellamy the new captain. Hornigold was stung by the loss but left peacefully, taking with him the men who wanted to stay under his command. Bellamy's pirates scoured the seas. They stopped every ship they could find, stealing choice booty. Sometimes, if they liked the look of the ship they were robbing, they took it, too. Eventually, Bellamy had choice booty from more than 50 ships and more than 200 men under his command, and a flotilla of 5 ships to carry it all, including the Whydah. The Whydah was a slave ship captained by Lawrence Prince, a veteran slaver who had recently sold his human cargo in Jamaica and was headed for England with holds full of gold and silver, and perhaps one perfect ruby the size of a hen's egg. When Bellamy caught the Whydah, his crew was overjoyed. After 18 months of plundering vessels on the high seas, they could now retire as rich men. They didn't retire, though, at least not right away. They plundered boats all the way up and down the coasts on their way to Maine. As they came even with Cape Cod, Bellamy ordered the coxswain to steer a north by northwest course towards the tip of the Cape. He was heading for Wellfleet. He was going home to see Maria. Although Bellamy didn't know it, life had not gone well for Maria. Her pregnancy had made her an outcast in her family. Her own parents could not accept the disgrace of their daughter's having a child out of wedlock, and they asked her to leave. Maria moved out of the house and into a tiny hut on a beach near Eastham. From there, she could watch the ships sail towards the Cape and wait for Bellamy's return. She hid in the hut, coming out only at night to conceal her pregnancy from the unforgiving Puritans. 7 months after Bellamy left to find his fortune, Maria gave birth to a black-haired boy. She delivered the child herself in the barn of John Knowles and kept the baby hidden in a bed of hay in the barn. Several times a day she would sneak back to the Knowles' barn to feed the baby. Then she would carefully conceal him under a pile of hay and return to her hut. One day, she opened the barn door to find John Knowles holding the child in his arms, a look of fright in his eyes. The baby was dead, having choked to death on a piece of straw. The sheriff of Eastham took the frightened young woman into custody. She was jailed for the crime of pregnancy out of wedlock and neglect of her child, but a sympathetic jailer left her cell door unlocked and she walked out, returning to her hut in Eastham, and was never put on trial. People accused her of being a witch. They avoided Maria's cabin lest they be cast under a spell that might bring them the kind of tragedy she had suffered. But there was more tragedy ahead for Maria. As the Whydah changed course that night and came closer to the Cape, winds from a frigid northeaster collided with a warm and moist southern wind that had been propelling Bellamy's flotilla from the Caribbean. The result was the greatest storm on record to hit Cape Cod. Winds were as high as 80 miles per hour and visibility was zero. The pirates had no chance. The Whydah hit a sandbar about 200 yards from shore and was buried by tons of water that poured over her wooden decks. Sailors were swept into the sea. The ones who managed to hang on were killed when the ship rolled. Only 9 pirates survived the shipwreck of the Whydah and 2 other ships they had taken. Bellamy was not one of them. He had become the most successful pirate of his day. At the height of his success, he was drowned in a freak storm, his body swept overboard, practically at the doorstep of his lover. Bill was quiet for a moment, in almost a reverent sort of way. In this moment of silence, I imagined the howling wind and the crashing waves and screams of the men who knew that this horrible instant was their last on earth. To this day, Bill said, locals say they can still hear Maria wailing for Sam Bellamy from the cliffs of Eastham. Pirates and buried treasure were the stuff of daydreams for kids on the Cape, and my mind was spinning wildly from the images in my head. I had imagined myself in the holds of the Whydah, running my hands through a huge pile of coins with other pirates, when Bill interrupted my fantasy. "Of course, some people on the Cape don't think the story is true," he said. "What do you think?" I asked, hoping for confirmation. "I know it's true," said Bill. I went back to dreaming about pirates and sunken treasure. For days I could think of nothing but the legend of Black Sam Bellamy. Not a day went by I didn't think of the Whydah, Bellamy, or Maria Hallett. They would be my obsession for the next 30 years. In 1965, I entered Trinidad Junior College in Colorado on a football scholarship. After a 2-year course of study at Trinidad, I transferred to Western State College in Gunnison, Colorado. It was there that I fell in love with Patsy. She was a champion skier, and we spent most of our free time on the slopes of Crested Butte. After knowing each other 6 months, Patsy announced that she was pregnant. We married right away. At the age of 24, I graduated with a double major in history and sociology and a minor in physical education. Barry Jr. was born when I was 25. My first daughter, Jenny, followed when I was 26. I felt that the birth of my children and graduation from college were 3 steps forward in my life because they represented phases in the maturing process. What happened next was a giant step backward. Our marriage broke up and Patsy decided to move to Central America. Although we tried to reconcile our differences, I soon found myself a divorced father with the custody of the children. I wasn't sure what to do. I had custody of Barry and Jenny and needed to do what was right. I decided our residence would be Kalispell, Montana, or Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Montana and the vast expanses and freedom of the American West appeal strongly to me, but once again I was drawn back to the vineyard where I could be close to the sea. Eventually, in search of the independence I still admired in my Uncle Bill, I started a construction firm. Divorce had left me unsure about marriage. I had come to accept not having a partner and was really quite happy as a single father. Jenny and Barry went with me everywhere and enjoyed visiting the various construction sites. Still, relationships happen, as one did in my life. I was looking for someone to paint murals on my children's walls, and one of my clients recommended a Swedish woman named Brigitta. She came and did the job and never left. We were married and had a son, Brandon. In the 70s, I started a small salvage and diving company on the sideline. Most of the time, I did easy jobs like inspecting ships' hulls for insurance companies, underwater surveying, or raising small anchors. I was after excitement as well as money, but excitement is what I got. I became known as a salver who would do almost anything, or at least try. My diving skills improved greatly through salvage work. I learned how to locate objects in deep water and how to raise them safely without damage. I also began to look at diving as a form of recreation. My idea of having fun was looking for shipwrecks. I began to research local wrecks and to dive on them. Sometimes I found nothing but the rusted hull of a ship. Other times I found bottles, pieces of china, and even a ship's bell. I became interested in finding older shipwrecks with interesting histories, including the General Arnold, a Revolutionary warship that sunk in Plymouth Harbor. A dive to a shipwreck is like a trip in a time machine, bringing you in contact with objects that were last touched hundreds of years before, putting you closer to the past than you ever thought possible. There is more wealth at the bottom of the sea than there ever was or will be on land, said Jules Verne in his classic 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was clear to me that he wasn't just talking about treasure you can cash in, but about intellectual and historical treasure as well. The notion of finding history intrigued me. I began to dream of becoming an underwater explorer because I could think of nothing more exciting. When I look back now, I can see 1982 was a pivotal year. I had imitated my Uncle Bill in many aspects of my life. I owned land and houses and had a successful business that had left me some free time to pursue diving. I had begun to think more and more about the Whydah and wanted to become the first person to excavate a pirate ship. I was then 36 years old, and I knew that if I was going to accomplish something unique, I had to do it before I became hopelessly stuck in the rut success had dug for me. And then there was Uncle Bill. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer and was fading fast. When I looked at Bill's struggle for breath, I hurt. Bill had helped me grow up. I could hardly imagine life without him. I canceled my work and devoted the summer to seeing as much of Bill as I could. Late that summer, we drove the rocky coast of Maine. This was one of Bill's favorite drives, and its rugged beauty helped ease the pain of his illness. At times we stopped to look at the cobalt blue ocean, but we didn't get out of the car since Bill was too weak to walk. It was during one of these stops that we again started talking about the Whydah. "Maybe I'll try to find the Whydah," I said, half joking. "I don't know, boy," he said, smiling through his pain. "I think that ship might never be found." "Still, I might give it a try," I insisted. "No one ever found the treasure, we know that." "If it's still there, I could find it." Bill looked at the ocean and was silent. For a moment I didn't think he heard me. Then I could tell that he was just lost in his thoughts. He nodded for a moment and then looked at me with a wry grin. "You'll never know unless you try, boy." 1 month later, Bill died. It was then that I committed to the search for the pirate ship Whydah that had been lost for 265 years. I knew the Whydah's story well and knew she would not be easy to find. I considered blindly looking for the ship, but realized that my chances of finding her without some kind of map were very slim. In an effort to pinpoint her remains, I sought out the work of Captain Cyprian Southhack, who had charted the waters around the Cape. The son of a British naval lieutenant, Southhack came to Boston in 1685 at the age of 23, and for 19 years commanded the Province Guard ship, a vessel used against the French and Indians in the skirmishes in Maine and Nova Scotia. Southhack's true love was the making of accurate maps. His attention to accuracy led him to the most frustrating duty in his life, the attempted salvage of the Whydah. Southhack was appointed the task of recovering the valuables from the Whydah by Samuel Shute, the new governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. Southhack's diary, which I had found at the Massachusetts State Archives, is a tale of frustration and anger aimed at man and nature alike. If he had not recorded the location of the Whydah accurately, I knew I was in trouble. Arriving at Provincetown by sloop on May 2, 1717, Southhack ordered 2 of his deputies to travel quickly to the Whydah to establish a watch over the wreck site. It had been a week since the ship had gone down. Afraid that the locals might beat him to the loot, Southhack left the next day for the site. In his rush to get to the Whydah, Southhack the mapmaker relied on information from an old map that showed a passageway by canal through the Cape to the Atlantic Ocean. Thinking that navigating the canal would be faster than traveling by horseback, Southack ordered his 8 deputies into a whaleboat for the trip to the canal. The canal was still there, but barely. 100 years of tidal action and heavy winds had all but erased it. Still, Southack insisted on trying this approach. Finally, after 14 hours of hard travel, the representatives of the governor saw what was left of the Whydah. The sight was disappointing. Waves had already beaten the pirate ship to pieces, which he wrote was strewn, quote, north and south, distanced from each other 4 miles. Pieces of the once proud Whydah were drifting onto the shore, mixing with the lifeless body of, quote, 54 white men and 5 Negroes. On May 4th, Southack sent 6 of his men out to work on the wreck. Gale-force wind and driving rain forced them to retreat. When the weather did not abate, Southack directed his men to pick up pieces of cable, quote, and other things, unquote, for transport back to the town of Billingsgate. They were not able to retrieve anything from the main part of the wreck. If Southack couldn't get any salvage from the ship, he would get what he could from the Cape Codders who might have beaten him to the site. He placed an ad in the newspaper establishing his authority to conduct a search and seizure operation. Forewarned, the citizenry of Eastham and the surrounding area was subject to door-to-door search by the driven cartographer. Although most of the residents freely allowed Southack and his deputies to examine their property, none admitted taking anything from the wreck site. One of the locals, Samuel Hardings, was more forthcoming than his fellows. He readily admitted having scavenged the beach in the early hours of April 26th and having hidden the purloined cargo in his Wellfleet farm. Although he refused to return any of the booty he felt rightfully his, he willingly told the cartographer the story of how he discovered the wreck. Fast asleep, Harding was awakened after midnight by a frantic pounding on his door. Opening his door to the gale-force winds, Harding found a man who was soaking wet, exhausted, and nearly dead on his feet. He was weeping and begging for warmth, which Harding did his best to provide by stoking the fire in the fireplace and boiling water for tea. The man's name was Thomas Davis. He had been a carpenter on the St. Michael, a cargo ship sailing from Cork, Ireland, to Jamaica. Just east of their goal, the ship was taken over by pirates, captained by Black Sam Bellamy. Bellamy's crew had been decent for pirates, Davis told his savior. In a businesslike fashion, they looted the ship and then offered everyone on the St. Michael a chance to go on the account and become a pirate. Before leaving the St. Michael and her frightened crew, one of the pirates asked if there was a carpenter on board. Unwittingly, Davis identified himself. In the next moment, he was conscripted into the ranks of the pirates. Davis had no interest in a life of robbery. He appealed directly to Bellamy to let him go, but since he was not married and seemed to have no deep attachments at home, his appeal for freedom was denied. Though Davis's pleas were at first rebuffed, later Bellamy promised the unhappy carpenter he would be set free with the next vessel captured. The promise was not kept. When Bellamy's crew took their next ship, the Whydah, the crew members learned of the agreement between their captain and the carpenter and put it to a vote. The crew voted to reverse Bellamy's decision and forced Davis to continue service as a carpenter of their new ship, the Whydah. Davis had carried out his duties until the ship wrecked. Harding and his wife listened with wide eyes to the carpenter's tale. It was fast approaching dawn, and the farmer decided to take his horse-drawn wagon to the beach. Salvaging shipwrecks was a way of life on the Cape. The locals even had a prayer for the occasion. "We pray thee, O Lord, not that wrecks should happen, but that if they happen, thou wilt guide them onto our shores for the benefit of the inhabitants." In the end, Southack's dogged pursuit of the salvage from the Whydah came almost to naught. He searched the shore for items that were worth something, but everything of true value seemed to be trapped in the Whydah, which he described as being upside down in water too deep, too rough, and too cold to be reached. It is doubtful that the hull was even intact by the time Southack arrived. It was probably splintering and disintegrating with each wave that pounded against it. Southack returned to map-making, his first love. He never again returned to the site of the Whydah. For several years, coins and other objects were found by beachcombers. but it was almost as though they had appeared magically out of the sand. The Whydah had completely disappeared. How long did it take for the ship to vanish? Not more than a few weeks, and possibly not more than a few days. The sands of the Cape change so dramatically that a strong storm can raise their levels by as much as 10 feet, bearing heavy objects before your very eyes. It is not uncommon for a sunken ship to be rapidly devoured by sand, especially sand that is so porous you can push your arm into it with little effort. I was convinced that the bulk of the treasure and everything else heavier than water was still out there at the wreck site. As Southhack put it so succinctly in 1717, the riches with the guns would be buried in the sands. I began to study Southhack's writings as if they were the Holy Scriptures. Every word was analyzed, every nuance considered. I was convinced that the clue to the Whydah's exact location was somewhere in his work and that I just hadn't figured it out yet. No map existed with an actual X to mark the spot. Southhack never wanted to return to the Whydah, so he wasn't precise about the site's whereabouts. Still, Southhack was a map maker, and a meticulous one at that. By force of habit, he must have noted something that would provide a clue to the ship's exact location. On either side of Southhack's charts, I posted contemporary maps and aerial photos of the coast. They reveal little other than the obvious fact that the Cape had bent to the northwest in 250 years. Wherever the Whydah was when she hit the shore, she was now at least 1,200 feet further out to sea. As I read Southhack's work over and over, I began to pick up certain geographical reference points. I would then mark these points on the maps with colored stick pins. For example, on May 4th, Southhack wrote of pieces of cable that he had transported from the site of the Whydah to a boat moored in a bayside town. Taking the cables to a vessel on the seaboard side would have been too dangerous because, as he wrote, there was no harbor in 25 miles of the wreck. By examining his map, I could see that Cape Cod Harbor, now known as Provincetown Harbor, was 25 miles away from Eastham Beach. I drew a line from Provincetown to Eastham that represented 25 miles and pushed in a pin. I did the same on a number of the wall maps. Another entry referred to the wreck being 3½ miles from Billingsgate. I was able to locate Billingsgate on Southhack's map, but it was missing from all the others. A victim of the Cape's shifting shape, Billingsgate had sunk more than 100 years ago. To make an accurate measurement on my maps, I had to visit the public library. Within a few days, I learned that only part of Billingsgate was underwater. The rest of the town was still part of Wellfleet. I set out to find the Billingsgate church that was used in 1717, assuming that Southhack set his distance from the town center. The church itself was gone, but the graveyard that surrounded it was still there on the fringe of modern Wellfleet. I used the site of the graveyard as my reference point. I marked the maps and felt the satisfaction of being that much closer to my goal. Another reference point in Southhack's writings was the location of Samuel Harding's farm. Harding's refusal to return any of the salvaged goods to Southhack proved such an annoyance to the cartographer that he wrote about him specifically in his letter to the governor, describing the location of Harding's house as 2 miles from the wreck. I contacted Slade Associates, a survey company in Wellfleet. From them, I hoped to find exactly where the Harding residence had been. Admittedly, I was looking for a needle in a haystack, but the meticulous record-keeping of the British paid off. Within a week, I received a call from the surveyor, who was able to tell me exactly where the Harding house once stood. With the information he provided, I was able to walk to the property and find the probable foundation of Harding's house. It was another reference point that I could mark on the wall maps with colored pushpins. Then one day it all came together. I was standing in the map room, looking at all the pins, when I decided to connect the dots. I drew a line from Billingsgate to the general area of the wreck site, and then followed suit with lines from Provincetown and Harding's house. Where they crossed at the shoreline gave me a sort of X. I knew this spot wasn't totally accurate, but it was as close as I could get without getting wet. And getting wet, by the way, was out of the question. If I had donned a wetsuit and gathered my artifacts from the site, I would never be given a permit to excavate the spot by the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. This state regulatory agency put its members in control of underwater sites, which, according to their charter, charged them with the responsibility of encouraging the discovery and reporting, as well as the preservation and protection of underwater archaeological resources. Among their strictest rules was one forbidding the collection of artifacts without permits. This rule had a way of hampering discovery, since the board would not issue a permit without artifacts from the wreck in question first being delivered to the board. These rules presented a catch-22, but one that I was able to circumvent with little effort. I arranged for a man with a metal detector to scour the sandy beach in front of the wreck site. He found several nails, ship's fittings, and other pieces of metal that might have belonged to the Whydah. I took photos of these objects and combined them with the historical and survey research, including all of Southhack's writing on the subject of the Whydah. I expected at least one of the members of the board to be difficult, and I prepared my case for that person, whoever he might be. In the end, it was surprisingly easy to get the permit from the board members. I presented my evidence, and they were enthralled by what they saw and heard. They issued a reconnaissance permit in my name, which would allow me to locate artifacts without bringing any to the surface. The permit declared that this searching had to be done with minimal site disturbance, which seemed illogical since the sea had been disturbing the site for 265 years. Still, I didn't argue. It was a start, and I was more than ready to start searching for the Whydah. It was already November and a tough time to be mounting an undersea adventure in the North Atlantic. Nevertheless, I decided to put together a group of experts to see what was down there. The first person I invited was Mel Fisher, perhaps the world's best-known treasure hunter. It was Fisher who, along with Kip Wagner, discovered hundreds of gold and silver coins and other artifacts from the same fleet of Spanish ships that had attracted Black Sam Bellamy to the coast of Florida in 1715. A 1965 National Geographic article pictured their treasures and reveled in their exploits. It was Fisher's discovery of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha in 1973 that caught everyone's attention. This treasure-laden Spanish galleon contained as much as $400 million, according to some experts. "I'll be there at 9 in the morning," he declared over the phone. "I'll bring a magnetometer and Fay Field with me to operate the thing. You do have a boat, don't you?" I said I did, although I was between boats at the moment, and the challenge of finding one on such short notice was daunting. I called a friend, John Beyer, and asked him if he knew anyone who had what I needed. "I can only think of one person," said Beyer. "There is a giant named Stretch Gray who owns a boat that is the right size for this operation. He's a lobsterman, though, so he has to get up early to do his job. I don't think he would appreciate being called at this time of night." "I have to call him," I insisted. "I need a boat, and I'm desperate." "Well, watch this one," said Beyer. "When I say he's a giant, I mean it. He's a real Goliath." I got Gray's telephone number anyway and made the call. As the ringing started, I noticed that the time on my clock read midnight. 10 rings later, he picked up the phone. "What is it?" he growled. I introduced myself and told him that I wanted to charter his boat to tow a magnetometer over the site of the Whydah. By now, several newspaper articles had appeared about my search, and I thought Stretch might be impressed at receiving an emergency telephone call from a major local figure in the news. He wasn't. When I finished explaining what I wanted, he simply snorted and hung up. He was friendlier when I called him at 7 the next morning. He listened again to what I wanted and then offered to charter his boat for one day. "I want to know what's down there, too," he declared. We agreed to meet at the dock that afternoon. We never made it out that day. Fisher's airplane was late, and by the time he arrived at the Cape, it was late in the afternoon and rapidly approaching sundown. Fisher was wearing a summer jacket and lightweight khaki pants and seemed unsuitably dressed for the cool weather of New England. Field, tall and thin, with a David Niven mustache and a tweed overcoat and hat, could have been dressed for an appointment with a New England banker. The only article of clothing that would have set him apart at a conference table of bankers was a large gold coin glistening from a gold chain and hanging outside his tie. Each of them wore one of these coins, which Fisher described as a royal strike worth $100,000. The next morning we boarded Stretch's boat and headed around the tip of the Cape for the Atlantic Ocean. In addition to the 4 of us, I brought John F. Kennedy, Jr., the son of the late president, who had worked with me all summer on my salvage boat on Martha's Vineyard. After hearing so many stories about the search for the Whydah, young Kennedy wanted to be part of the remote sensing survey. The plan was to map the wreck site using the magnetometer that Field had brought with him. A magnetometer, extremely heavy and shaped like a small torpedo, is the best instrument to use in locating shipwrecks. Our instrument would respond to iron by registering a hit on a strip chart that Field had set up in the boat's cabin. A hit, or anomaly, means that the mag has detected something made of iron or steel. As the mag was towed over the ocean's bottom, a strip of paper would reel out as the stylus drew a line on it. Regular ocean bottom registered as a relatively straight line, while metal made the pen jump. The larger the metal object, the sharper the jump. Each jump of the stylus would be noted on a map by Field. As we rounded Race Point and headed down the Atlantic side of the Cape, Mel told me about one of his greatest mag moments, the discovery of the Santa Margarita, a magnificent treasure ship that went down in the same storm that took the Etosha to the bottom off the Marquesa Keys near Florida. We didn't know where that ship was, he said, shouting over the drone of the boat's diesel engine. We had historical information that put the wreck either west or east of the Etosha, as far as 3 miles away. That's a lot of ocean. Field here had just developed his new magnetometer, and we wanted to test it out, said Fisher. It was damned expensive. I wanted to make sure it was worth the money. The mag was installed on Captain Robert Jordan's boat and towed through the water west of the Etosha site, back and forth, like a tractor plowing. The boat plied the ocean. The pen barely moved on the strip chart. After conferring with Fisher, Jordan took his boat to one of the eastern sites and started the search all over again. This time, at the edge of a wide sandbar, the pen jumped sharply. A diver was sent down and found a 6-foot copper cooking cauldron, a grapnel hook, and 3 small anchors. A little ways away, we found a bunch of pottery and 4 Spanish coins, said Fisher. We cleaned those coins and found that they were minted in 1621, the same period as the Etosha. We knew we had her then. The rest of Fisher's story was a treasure hunter's dream. The Santa Margarita site was a bonanza of gold, silver, and artifacts, including a cannonball fashioned from stone quartz. As Stretch steered careful parallel passes back and forth over the wreck site, I dreamed about the search I would soon undertake. In my mind's eye, I imagined the wreck of the Whydah just like the Margarita. "That's a big something down there," said Fisher. The needle that measured hits was jumping sporadically, and Field was marking the position of those hits on the map. Mel was looking over Field's shoulder, jumping and nodding in rhythm with the meter. At times it looked like Fisher was listening to a jazz band. The meter was so active. We mapped what could be the wreck site for 3 days, charting virtually every piece of metal that could be found. When Field announced that he was finished, we gathered in the pilot house and looked at the map. I felt a tingle of excitement in the pit of my stomach. As Fisher and Field pondered the hits and guessed at which might be cannons, I could hear the voice of my Uncle Bill as he told me about the legendary wreck that we had now mapped. "Why don't you go down there and take a look?" said Fisher. "We are right over one of the strongest hits. You might find something right now." I told Kennedy to suit up. This would be the first dive on the site, and I hoped I had the same luck that Fisher had with the Margarita, an immediate sighting of gold bars, followed by a cannon or two, and then the spiny ribs of the ship. Instant treasure. Kennedy lowered himself into the icy ocean and slipped beneath the waves. The November light, so clear and sharp on the surface, sent soft beams streaming into the water. He followed them down. The wave action whipped up grains of sand, and soon the visibility was as limited as a desert sandstorm. Kennedy dropped head first, further and further, until he literally bumped into the bottom with his face mask. Then he righted himself and looked around. All he could see was sand. He followed his bubbles up and surfaced next to the boat. 3 faces peered over the side at Kennedy as he tipped his face mask back and removed the regulator from his mouth. "It looks like an underwater version of the Sahara Desert," he said. "Great," I thought. "Wherever the Whydah is located, it will be under feet and tons of sand." I sighed, thinking about all the time this excavation would take, and all the money. Fisher looked towards the shore at the mountain of sand that had made up the cliffs of the beach. They were at least 60 feet high and dropped to a sandy beach that was being pounded by surf that was clouded with large granules of sand. There wasn't a rock in sight, just sand. "I guess that makes sense," he said, helping Kennedy up the ladder into the boat. "There's nothing around here but sand." Fisher and Field stayed on the Cape for several days after the initial dive. I rented a small house for them in Truro and moved in with them to hear what they had to say about wreck diving. In many ways, it was like having a kung fu student moving into the master's cave. As it turned out, Fisher was an expert at moving sand. His first big find, the wedge wreck near Vero Beach, Florida, was found after Fisher and Field developed a device that diverts a boat's prop wash straight down, blowing sand away to create a deep cone-shaped hole. Called mailboxes because they look like giant metal versions of their namesake, these contraptions stick out from the back of the boat like rocket engines until they are dropped vertically at right angles to the boat and aimed at the seafloor. He recommended using mailboxes for my operation, as it also involves salvage and sand. Handheld metal detectors were also important pieces of equipment, said Fisher. I would also need a Loran receiver and detailed charts to plot the locations of objects on a map. A crew of about 10 would also be necessary to run the operations on the boat, with at least 6 of them certified to dive. The boat should have a big cabin for all the electronics gear and a couple of cranes that are capable of bringing up objects as large as cannon, said Fisher. Oh yeah, the boat should be wooden. A metal hull sometimes interferes with the magnetometer. Since I had been in the salvage business for some time, I knew firsthand most of the techniques Fisher was describing. Fisher did give me one piece of advice that seemed puzzling at the time. He declared that the most important attribute I could possess would be mental stability. He told me to stay realistic and focused on the work, not on the millions of dollars I thought I would bring up. He suggested that I try to keep the crew from thinking about the treasure, too. For some reason, daydreaming leads to paranoia and greed, said Fisher. Those things can infect a crew like a deadly virus. I don't think that'll happen with the guys I have in mind, I said confidently. We're good friends, kind of like a fraternity. Well, if greed doesn't happen with them, it will happen from outside the fraternity, said Fisher. As you smell gold and file a claim, 10 other guys are going to show up at the claims office and say they smelled it first. That hasn't happened yet, and I've already filed a claim, I said. Maybe you'll be lucky, but make sure you have a good attorney just in case, said Fisher. Like the man said, I know what gold does to men's souls. Don't let it do it to yours or you're finished. I grinned nervously and nodded as though I knew what Fisher was talking about. In my heart, I was skeptical. Looking back, I can say that Fisher's advice was the best I ever received. Already the sharks were beginning to circle. The Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources had given me a reconnaissance permit that I found to be extremely restrictive. For one thing, I could not remove any artifacts I might find without an excavation permit. In fact, read a certain way, the recon permit would not even allow me to uncover artifacts, which meant I would not be allowed to blow sand away to see what their permit would not allow me to pick up. But most disturbing to me was that part of the law that said all the artifacts had to be sold at fair market value once the final report was accepted by the board. The money would then be divided, with 25% going to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I didn't find this aspect of the law fair, nor did I find it particularly American. Although British Admiralty law requires a split between the explorer and the state, United States Admiralty law reads, or at least did in those days, that the first person to find an abandoned ship is the owner and has to give nothing to the state. Rather than accept the rules that the state of Massachusetts and the Board of Underwater Archaeology set down, I decided to fight the state from the beginning. I talked to my lawyer, Alan Tefanction, about my decision, and he agreed. He said the state's claim to the artifacts could not withstand a challenge in court, and if it did, well, he was pragmatic. The worst thing that can happen is you'll end up owing the state 25% of the treasure, he reasoned. In order to lay claim to the wreck and its treasure, Admiralty law said that I had to arrest the wreck. To do this, said Tefanction, I would have to bring an artifact from the Whydah into court. This object would represent the ship and would allow the court to assume jurisdiction over the wreck and award it to me. I think we can pull this off, said Tefanction. Personally, I don't think the state has any claim to this or any other wreck that has been abandoned. On November 22nd, we filed an admiralty action in the United States District Court in Boston seeking title to the fruits of the wreck. After hearing Tefanction's argument, the court issued a warrant for the arrest of the wreck and appointed my company, Maritime Underwater Surveys, as the custodian of the vessel. The state, of course, did not agree with this decision. Reporter Gail Fee of the Cape Cod Times called me on December 2nd, 1982, to say that the state of Massachusetts was going to lay claim to their rightful portion of whatever I found. Talk about pirates, I thought. As Fee asked me for a reaction to the announcement, I was far more upset than I let on. I told her I didn't believe that the state had any jurisdiction over this wreck and that federal law should apply. Under federal law, sunken treasure is finders keepers, I said. The next day, I picked up my copy of the Cape Cod Times and read a headline and story that hit me like a bucket of cold seawater that said that the state was claiming ownership of the Whydah, too. The article went on to say not only was the state jumping my claim, they were even doubting I had the Whydah to begin with. State archaeologist Brona Simon went so far as to say that our find could be another ship. I read the article a couple of times slowly and put the newspaper down. Suddenly I had a knot in my stomach and doubt in my mind. Unlike the state's expert, who had never been to the wreck site, I was sure what I had found was the Whydah. I understood what Mel Fisher was referring to when he warned me about claim jumpers. I knew it would happen, but I didn't expect the first of the jumpers to be the state where I paid my taxes. On December 10th, the state's response to our claim was made official. The state's Attorney General filed papers suggesting that the federal courts lacked jurisdiction to rule on our claim because the Commonwealth of Massachusetts claimed to own the Whydah. The state also declared that Maritime's suit in federal court claiming title to the Whydah amounted to a suit against the state by the federal government, an act barred by the 11th Amendment of the Constitution. On the same day that the Attorney General filed his papers in federal court, the Commonwealth filed an instant declaratory relief action to establish title to the Whydah. When I read all these papers, I didn't know what they meant. I did know that politicians, like pirates, can smell money, and when they do, they chase it as hard as they can. I understood what it would feel like to be chased by pirates. When it was announced that I had found the Whydah, I had suddenly more friends that I could handle. Old girlfriends called to rekindle the flame. Guys I had gone to college with and barely remembered called to tell me about their failed marriages and dreadful jobs and wondered if in some way they could join me in my search for pirate treasure. I didn't need friends, I needed money. I had already invested more than $100,000 of my personal money. In addition, my construction business was foundering badly from neglect, as was my marriage, both suffering from the fact that all of my time was being devoted to finding the Whydah. My search for investors began at the Aspen, Colorado Police Department. In retrospect, that may seem strange, but who might know more rich and adventurous people than the man in charge of law and order in the West's wealthiest town? That person was Rob McClung. We had been best friends 10 years earlier at Trinidad Junior College in Colorado. "I know a few rich people," said Rob over the phone with his usual self-confidence. "If I put together a group to talk to, will you come out and tell them what you need?" "Sure," I said. "I need $250,000 to dive for an entire season. I think that's all it's going to take to find her." "That's a lot of money," said Rob, taken aback, "but I'll see what I can do." A few days short of New Year's, I was on an airplane flying to Colorado. Rob had called to announce that he had put together an audience of people with money who were interested in hearing about the Whydah project. Included in the group was John Levin, a long-haired judge who sat on the board of a Telluride bank, Mickey Salloway, a local real estate developer, and Bob Lazier, who owned the Tivoli Lodge in Vail, a beautiful sprawling hotel at the base of that town's popular ski slopes. I thought about my presentation during my trip and the next day as I nervously shook hands with everyone before sitting down in Lazier's penthouse, a 6,000-square-foot apartment overlooking the mountains from atop the Tivoli Lodge. The group gave me its undivided attention as I talked for nearly an hour. I remember few details of my pitch other than the line I ended with, "It's a risk, but you have a chance to be the first ever to discover an authentic pirate ship." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, like children given a chance to question Long John Silver himself, they began enthusiastically to ask questions. "How do you know Bellamy really existed? Is it possible that all the treasure floated away? Is the North Atlantic really so rough that people couldn't swim to the wreck site?" The most interested person in the room was Bob Lazier. He said later that he wanted to invest as soon as he heard that I had invested $100,000 of my own money and didn't expect to get it back from the initial investor's money. "You had obviously made the commitment," he said. "You were going to do it now or never." Lazier was one of the most interesting people I'd ever met. Raised in an orphanage in Minnesota, Lazier had developed a strong independence at an age when most kids do not know the meaning of the word. When he decided to see the world, Lazier climbed out the upstairs window of the converted mansion that served as a home for orphans and hopped a freight train to Chicago, eventually putting a successful career as an IndyCar racer behind him and becoming a developer of commercial real estate. He was impressed by the Whydah project. He listened to the story of Black Sam Bellamy and his treasure-laden ship with the fidgety impatience of a man who was wealthy and curious about the world around him. Although he had a fortune estimated at $25 million, Lazier was not all that interested in the money-making possibilities of the Whydah. What impressed him was the way the study of pirates could change history. These guys were floating democracies, declared Lazier, excited about the fact that pirates elected the people who ran their ships. Just think, it may have been that the Constitution of the United States was influenced by the men who flew the Jolly Roger. The thought that we could rewrite history was a moving one for Lazier. He immediately began to talk about a pirate museum in which the artifacts of these early Democrats could be displayed for all to see. The idea excited us both. As Lazier paced his penthouse and talked, he swept by a writing desk and picked up a legal pad. In a moment he sat down and began jotting down the details of the Whydah financing. I remember looking at the clock and seeing that it was 10 p.m. As Lazier sat at the table and worked and talked, we gathered one by one around him. The next thing I knew, it was 1 a.m. All of us were exhausted by the money discussion. "I'm going to bed," said Lazier, throwing down his pen and marking an abrupt end to the meeting. Everyone else agreed and drifted off to our respective rooms in the penthouse. I tried to get comfortable, but soon found that sleeping was impossible. No matter how hard I tried, the excitement of realizing my dream kept me awake. At 3 a.m., I got dressed and went into the living room. Bob Lazier was sitting at the table, looking at the figures on the legal pad. "I couldn't sleep either," he said, pushing a chair out with his foot for me to sit down. "Let's figure this thing out right now." By 4 a.m., we had structured the deal and were ready to lay it out for the others when they got up out of bed several hours later. A private placement stock corporation would be formed called Maritime Explorations. I would keep 1/3 of the stock as president of the company. About 50% of the stock would be kept in reserve. The rest of the stock would be sold in $10,000 increments to investors to raise $250,000. Lazier liked the idea of a stock corporation because it was more democratic. "Everyone who owns stock gets to vote on the future of the company," said Lazier. "That gives everyone a chance to be in on the decision-making process." Following this strategy, Lazier compiled a list of 25 possible investors and invited them to his penthouse. Included were Howard Head, founder of Head Skis, and a lovely woman weighted so heavily with diamonds, emeralds, and gold that she looked like an open treasure chest. We made a sales pitch that included all the information we had to date, including the story of Black Sam Bellamy and Maria Hallett. The potential investors were fascinated at the prospect of turning this myth into fact, or at least working toward it. At the end of the pitch, 17 in the group wrote $10,000 checks. "We're right around the corner," said Lazier. He called on a few more friends. At midnight on January 12th, we received our final check. Just as easily as it sounds, we had raised $250,000. The search for the Whydah could now begin. Stretch Gray was my first crewman, whose lobster boat I had rented from Mel Fisher when he came up to help me mag for the Whydah site. Although Stretch was my first crewman, I often joke that he was my first two crewmen because of his massive size, 6 feet 10 inches tall and 325 pounds. He would make the perfect captain. The second person on board was John Beyer, who became a crewman of the Whydah expedition by default. Beyer had come to work for my salvage business a couple of years earlier. Eventually, he became my right-hand man in both my salvage and construction business. John was a self-starter and always had been. He made a terrific addition to the expedition team. Both Beyer and Stretch Gray were ready to crew on a boat that I didn't yet have. I considered a wide variety of boats, including some of the fishing vessels that graced the harbor of Provincetown. While I was scouring the classified ads in National Fisherman, I found an ad that caught my eye. Gamage Boatyard in Bristol, Maine was advertising a 65-foot sonar chaser that had been built for the Navy by the yard's namesake, Harvey Gamage. When Stretch came by later that afternoon, I showed him the ad and we decided that we should drive up to Maine to make a closer inspection of the boat. "This looks good on paper," I said, waving the page at Stretch. "Let's go see if she has any possibilities." When we left to look at the boat, I was well on my way to crossing the path Black Sam Bellamy had pursued so many years ago. Bellamy probably left England for the New World to search for employment. The Spanish War of Secession between England and Spain had ended, and its end had meant the loss of thousands of jobs for English sailors of all stripe. It was from these ranks of the nautically unemployed that Bellamy probably came, arriving in Provincetown in the spring of 1715. About the time that Bellamy arrived in Provincetown, the wreck of the Spanish plate fleet took place on the coast of Florida. The loss of the plate fleet nearly bankrupted Spain, creating a money-making opportunity so great that historians have compared it to the California gold rush of 1849. All told, 11 ships wrecked. More than 700 people died, and more than 14 million pesos were left sitting on the floor of the shallows off the East Florida coast. What Bellamy was doing for a living at this time is anybody's guess. The notion of 14 million pesos sitting on the ocean floor would have to have been a heady one for the broke yet entrepreneurial young Brit. This must have seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. Bellamy had just one problem. Who could he get to finance his venture? A spit of land that juts into Massachusetts Bay like a crow's beak, Great Island is a peninsula that must have been named at the highest tides. When the moon is full and the tide is at its peak, this heavily wooded promontory is cut off from the mainland by salt water that oozes from porous marshland. Despite its natural beauty, few white settlers ever lived there. In fact, few people ever even visited Great Island, regardless of creed or color. It was just too far out of the way, which made the existence of the Great Island Tavern even more mysterious. Built around 1712, the remote yet thriving tavern was purchased by Israel Cole shortly before Bellamy came to the Cape. Historians have recently concluded that Cole was married to a cousin of Sam Bellamy's. If true, that would explain much about the financing of Bellamy's career. Cole was a smuggler who ran a smuggler's den. The notion of salvaging the Spanish plate fleet was most likely discussed at Great Island Tavern. I can imagine the Coles and the Browns and the Paynes, all related through marriage and occupation, sitting around the tavern considering the possibilities that a sunken treasure fleet might offer. All a treasure hunter would have to do is snag one casket of coins, and he would be rich beyond his dreams. By the end of these speculations, there were at least two people who were convinced that the Spanish plate fleet could be had: Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams. Williams was the middle-aged son of a former Rhode Island Attorney General. Married with 2 children, he was a moderately successful jeweler. He had come to the Cape to visit relatives and began spending time with Bellamy. Williams saw the good sense in pursuing sunken treasure. What transpired is not part of the historical record, but we do know that Williams put much of his personal wealth, as well as his life, into the hands of Sam Bellamy. During the next several weeks, they acquired a boat, probably a 2-masted schooner, and assembled a small crew. During these days of planning, Bellamy met Maria Hallett. There are many versions of the story of Sam and Maria, including the one told to me by my Uncle Bill. But the truth about their brief relationship will always remain shrouded in speculation. What Sam Bellamy did next, however, became a well-substantiated part of world history. "Barry, this boat is awesome." Those were the first words from Stretch's mouth when I picked up the telephone. He had taken the lonely drive to Bristol, Maine, to examine the vast Explorer. "What's so good about it?" "Well, for one thing, she isn't a fishing boat." He laughed. "She is built to be a research vessel." I was elated because Stretch was elated. As a man who was born to be on the water, Stretch knew a good boat when he saw it. I packed a bag and drove up to Bristol. The Gamage Boatyard was a legend, a place where the beautiful trees of Maine and other parts of the world were crafted by nautical engineers into some of the most revered vessels to sail the 7 seas. Harvey Gamage himself had passed away several years earlier, and his boatyard was dying a slow technological death. Builders could not compete with manufacturers who used cheaper material like fiberglass that allowed faster methods of construction. Gamage's grandson, Linwood, was converting the Fable facility into a marina by refitting the huge boat dock to accommodate pleasure boats. Because of the construction, there was only one boat at the Gamage dock the day I arrived, the vast Explorer. Standing alone, I gazed at the black and white beauty rocking at her berth. There was no question that Stretch had summed her up with one word: awesome. Constructed of solid pieces of white oak, her hull was thick and seemingly unsinkable. Because she was wooden, there would be no interference with the magnetometer that a metal hull would present. Her deck was covered with thick asphalt tiles that made an excellent non-slip working surface, and her mast was built like an oil derrick and fitted with a hoist that could lift several tons. After we bought the boat, the employees of the Gamage Boatyard began the task of refitting and painting the 65-footer for treasure hunting duty. Several changes were made, including the installation of mailboxes, the metal tubes that drop down and fit over the propellers to divert their thrust straight down and clear the sand from the ocean bottom. The Gamage people estimated that they would have the boat completed by the end of June, which was too late. "It'll speed things up if you leave your crew here to help," said Linwood Gamage. "Then maybe we could finish by sometime in May." I hesitated for a moment. The investors' money had not arrived yet from Colorado, and I was paying the operating costs out of my own pocket. Having made a down payment on the boat and an advance payment on the refitting, I was practically out of money, which made my wife back in Martha's Vineyard extremely nervous. I told Stretch and Byers that I was nearly out of cash, but if they would stay and work while we waited for money to come in, I would pay them the wages I owed them plus shares of stock. I felt uneasy at making the offer, especially since we hadn't even started searching for the ship, let alone found her. The response that came back was sudden and definite. "We'll take it," declared Stretch. The hearts of Black Sam Bellamy and Williams must have sunk when they arrived in the Gulf of Florida, since salvage efforts by the Spanish had already begun. With the efficiency of a mighty sea power, the Spanish had secured the area, leaving looters to their unfulfilled dreams. The treasure was saved for the Spanish by the fast action of Admiral Francisco Salmon, the highest-ranking survivor of the shipwreck. The Spanish had so thoroughly swept the area that what was left, perhaps 20%, would not be found for more than 250 years when treasure hunters like Mel Fisher began to comb this area with modern salvage techniques. Bellamy and crew may have grappled the sites or dragged a rope between two ships in hope of snagging something of value. They must have realized, though, that the Spanish had beaten them to the gold. At some point, the two sailors must have wondered what their future held. A return to the colonies as failures would make them the laughingstocks of the Cape. They may have also been indentured to others like Israel Cole, who may have put money into the venture and would be furious at the loss of an investment dollar. As their tiny boat pitched and creaked with the wind and waves of the Gulf, the entrepreneurs sat with their heads together and realized that their venture was broke. Making the decision to go pirate may have been their best choice. For me, the project was full speed ahead. It was spring of 1983, and my preparations were moving forward faster than the money was coming in from the investors. My wife watched in horror as our finances rapidly poured into the project. She could not understand my fascination with a shipwreck that had taken place more than 250 years ago, and could not believe a group of wealthy men in Colorado might have an interest in a Cape Cod pirate, let alone invest in a project to find his ship's remains. She thought I had lost my mind, along with everyone remotely involved in this exploration. "If they get into your blood, treasure and history become like food," I told her. "You need them to live." She just shrugged. She liked the comfortable and sure life we had been leading, and saw the Whydah expedition as a threat. It was clear to me that Brigetta and I had reached a crossroads, one that would see us taking separate paths. I began searching for a house to rent and found a massive colonial near Nauset Inlet, a shallow harbor out of which I planned to work with a high-speed boat. The two-story house was white with green trim and set in a majestic grove of maples and birches. I discovered later that the house was located next to Jeremiah's Gutter, a narrow, marshy groove through which Southack had rowed from the harbor to the Atlantic on his failed attempt to salvage the Whydah. The irony of this location was not lost on me. What Southack had started, I was now going to finish, or at least I hoped I would finish. The team members for the first Whydah expedition started coming together in February. In addition to Stretch and Byer, who were still in Maine, Todd Murphy joined the group. He was a Green Beret in the Army Reserve who was pursuing a degree in exercise physiology from the University of Connecticut. Todd was a stickler for safety and eventually filled the important role as head diver. Also joining us was Charlie Burnham, a friend of mine from Martha's Vineyard, who had honed his mechanical genius at Yale and was now studying robotics. And of course there was Rob McClung, Things were not going so well for the chief of police of Aspen. He had been accused of stealing a pistol from the evidence locker of the police department, and the local prosecutor had turned up damning evidence. After that, his days at the police department of the most beautiful city in Colorado became numbered. McClung wanted to start a new life. He decided that new life would be as a treasure hunter. I ignored the charges that had forced McClung to leave the police department. The Rob McClung I hired onto the project was the one I had gone to college with at Trinidad. For me, the Whydah expedition was like a college reunion, the good old days revisited, and I was blind to the notion that 10 years had changed some of my old friends a lot. Along with McClung came John Levin. He was the district judge in Aspen who helped us arrange financing. A good businessman and a junkie for adventure. Levin liked what he heard about the Whydah project and asked to be made business manager of maritime explorations. At the time, he seemed the perfect person for the job. A former prosecutor from New York who had worked on the Frank Serpico police corruption investigation, Levin had long black hair and big dark eyes that led many people to say that he resembled the actor Al Pacino. The more Levin heard about the Whydah, the less he liked his job as a judge. In addition, he lived vicariously through McClung, accompanying him on many of the drug busts the head policeman loved to carry out. Now that McClung was leaving to hunt treasure, Levin decided that he wanted to join him as a member of a team of treasure hunters. I talked to Lazier about the appointment of Levin to the post of business manager, and he thought it was a fine idea. McClung approved too. He declared Levin one of his best friends and said that the soon-to-be former Aspen judge would make an excellent addition to the team. But something happened between Levin and McClung between the time I hired him as business manager in Colorado and the day they arrived on the Cape. It was near the end of February, and he was upset. Gingerly, he took me aside to talk about it. "Look, am I second in command?" "Yeah, you're second in command," I said, somewhat taken back by the question. Levin nodded and continued with his line of questioning. "That means I get to make all the business decisions, and you get to make all the decisions that have to do with salvage, correct?" "Okay, that sounds good," I replied. "You handle the business, and I'll handle the salvage." "Okay, and I get to make my first decision now," insisted Levin. "I'm going to make a decision, and you're not going to block it, right? I've got your word on it?" He had clearly put me in a corner. "Okay, you've got my word. You are second in command, and I will not block your decision." "Okay, I'm firing McClung." I stared at Levin with wide eyes for a moment, and then chuckled at the irony of what I had just heard. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "This guy's my friend. Hell, he's your friend. He's the one that brought you into this project." "We may think he's our friend, but he's not," insisted Levin. "I'm firing him. I can't work with him. I can't trust him. I am firing him, and you gave me your word that I could do it." I told Levin that a decision like this required some thought. After he left, I telephoned Lazier and told him what had transpired. Surprisingly, my veiled partner and confidant did not seem surprised by what Levin had said. In fact, he seemed to support his point of view. "Maybe he's right," said Lazier. "McClung seems to be trying to get into your shoes. Maybe you just don't see it yet." Some conversations had taken place between Levin and McClung that made Levin realize that the ex-cop would be a problem later, if not sooner. Levin would not tell me what had been said, and I am not certain that it would have made a difference in my loyalty had I known. Levin went ahead and fired McClung, but I intervened to bring him back. Maybe McClung was just feeling powerless because of everything that had happened to him, I told Levin. Maybe he had said some things he really didn't mean to say about me. "I'm willing to forgive and forget," I said to the judge. We all went on with the business of treasure hunting, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. Through the smiles was an undercurrent of bad feeling that kept me on edge. Suddenly, there was no one I could talk with openly, causing me to become more guarded. As I continued to study pirates, I realized that captains like Bellamy were never fully in control of their crews. A pirate captain was elected by his men to bring out the best in the crew. Election to this post gave him a cabin of his own, but the men could enter at any time without permission. The captain received an extra share of the loot, but he did not exercise absolute rule. The only time his rule was absolute was in time of conflict, when a prize ship was being taken or a ship was under attack. The rest of the time, the captain was just one vote in a floating democracy. Part of the reason seamen became pirates was to get away from the cruel merchant captains who ruled with an iron fist. As an added safeguard against the pirate captain, they elected a quartermaster whose primary job was to act on behalf of the company the way a union steward acts on behalf of his fellow union members. The quartermaster inspected weapons, administered punishment, kept track of provisions, and most important, divided the captured loot among the men. The pirate captain had no need to watch his back because there were long-standing rules that governed the way pirates operated. These rules, called simply the Articles, were an antidote to treasure fever and the single greatest bond that held pirates together. Evolving from the 17th century Congress of Privateers in Jamaica, the Articles were written law that governed every known pirate company. They most certainly were adopted by Bellamy's men when the decision was made to go pirate. A version of the Articles was probably drawn up by the newly elected quartermaster, Palsgrave Williams, and signed by every man on board who wanted to stay and become a buccaneer. It is not known exactly how many ships Bellamy and crew plundered along the Central American coast, but it is certain that several surrendered to the novice pirates. When the looting was completed, the merchantman's crew was offered a chance to join the pirates. I am sure that Bellamy was a successful recruiter. His success was due, in part, to his eloquence as a speaker. Another factor was the nature of the business of which he was recruiting. It was, after all, treasure hunting. Aboard the vast Explorer, equipped now with all the necessary tools, we marked all the major hits from the magnetometer on a map on the dive site. Within a few days, we were at the spot where Kennedy had made the first dive. Given the large hits that registered on the magnetometer, it seemed like a good area in which to start digging. From an earlier magging venture on the Crumstay, we had marked all the hot spots with buoys. Now Stretch was left with the task of positioning the vast Explorer over the target. Positioning the anchors is extremely dangerous work, especially in surf conditions. We use a 3-point anchoring system with a bow and 2 stern anchors. By using hydraulic winches to lengthen and shorten individual lines, we can move the boat anywhere we want within the triangle without starting the boat's engines. When the mailboxes are down and in place, the vast Explorer is no longer a boat, but a floating platform that cannot move on its own. If we broke loose from our mooring, which could happen if we were hit by a sudden squall or rogue wave, the Vast would suffer the same fate as the Whydah, running aground on the terrible beauty, the beach. We chased the hits all over the map that first dry season. Sometimes we dug on large hits because we thought that maybe they were cannons or a mass of cannonballs that had managed to stay together, despite the 2.5 centuries of rough weather. Other times we dug on smaller hits, believing that individual, lighter objects had scattered and we were on the outer ring of the wreck site. What we found instead was the litter of 20th century warfare, objects like .50 caliber bullets and practice bombs, all from the Army Air Corps airplanes that had used this lovely stretch of beach to practice for World War II. Our lack of success made us the town joke. Some believed me to be a scam artist who had sold a myth to investors and nothing more. Others said that they had told me where the Whydah was most likely located and accused me of having jumped their claim. Still, I stayed focused, as did most of the crew. The one person who wasn't staying focused was my business partner, John Levin. He was upset that we hadn't found the Whydah right away, and he left only after a few months on the project. The former judge had been starting his own salvage company and planned to leave as soon as he got enough action going. "Do you think we'll ever see Levin again?" I asked McClung one day. His answer gave me pause. "Let me put it this way," he said. "I don't think you will ever see John Levin again." In September, our first season came to an abrupt end. Our archaeologist, Ted Duffleson, quit in a huff, claiming that we had a vague and inconsistent chain of command. He was also upset at the high profile the project had achieved in the media. He felt that the dig should have been conducted under the most secretive conditions until he, the archaeologist, decided that the information could be released. The Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources ordered the Whydah site shut down until a new archaeologist was hired. I thought about fighting the ruling, but Tefanction, my lawyer, pointed out that we had agreed to follow Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires an on-site archaeologist at all times during excavation. "Why fight so late in the season, anyway?" asked the Fanction. "It's almost winter, and you won't be able to dig anyway. Just fall back and regroup." Looking back on the Whydah project, the first season of digging was clearly the worst we ever had. We found nothing from the Whydah at all. I said to Fanction, "Next year better turn around, or we're in trouble." The second season was shaping up to be as disappointing as the first. Our artifact bins were still empty, and most everyone was totally frustrated by the Whydah project. There was grumbling about the hard work, and some backstabbing was in the air as well. McClung began to tell everyone how he would do it better if he were in charge. I had thought that McClung would be less hostile with Levin absent from the scene. To me, Levin had been a catalyst for McClung's bad behavior. I was beginning to realize McClung needed no catalyst. If the Whydah expedition crew was testy and almost at the end of its collective rope, then the Whydah project itself was already there. I had not told anyone, but we were out of money. I had managed to stretch the initial $250,000 investment through most of the second season, but now there was nothing left. My remaining cash would finance food and fuel for less than a week. I told Stretch the situation, and he just shrugged and offered his solution. Buy the essentials and let's go until we can't go anymore. So that's what we did. On July 20th, we positioned the Vast over an unexplored site and dropped anchor. Lowering the mailboxes, we blew a big hole and waited for the sand to settle. We had a camera crew with us from NBC, headed by Nancy Fernandez, an excellent correspondent who had been pushing us for the last few days so she could get the shot she needed. We suited up a new guy, Mike Sturgis, and sent him down. He was young and excited and ready for action. The rest of us were tired and burned out and somewhat cynical. No sooner had Mike gone to the bottom than he came right back up. From the look in his eyes, some of us thought he had seen the ghost of Black Sam Bellamy. "Hey, you guys," he shouted after ripping out his mouthpiece. "There's 3 cannons down there." A jolt of electricity ran through the crew. "Rob, suit up and get down there," I shouted. I would have dived myself, but I had developed serious inner ear problems from all the diving I had been doing. Rob needed no help in getting into his wetsuit. He pulled it on in a rush of rubber and weight belts and was in the water in a splash. The NBC cameras were rolling, capturing everything on film for a segment that would make it on the evening news for sure. In a few moments, McClung came up with a big smile on his face. 'Cause Sturgis had indeed found 3 cannons, he confirmed. In his hands, McClung carried an intriguing chunk of encrusted salvage. As the cameras rolled, he raised it over his head and handed it off. Someone pulled the find from Rob's hand and put it on deck. Then we all stood over it and stared. "Let's take a close look at this," I said. I held a concretion and tapped it slightly with a hammer. After several minutes of gingerly tapping around what looked like a shell fragment, I gently wiggled what appeared to be a coin from the concretion. From its uneven edges and markings on its face, I knew I was holding a Spanish piece of 8. I flipped it over to reveal a Spanish cross with markings that clearly identified it was from 1688. "I think we have a pirate ship here," I said, holding the coin up for everyone to see. There was an eruption of unrestrained joy as the hard-working crew realized that at last we had found proof that the Whydah was below us. Until now, the sky had been clear, with the exception of a small black cloud that had lingered on the horizon most of the day. In the frenzy of dealing with the artifact, no one had noticed the cloud move over our boat and become darker. As soon as I declared the presence of the pirate ship, the cloud made itself known with a bright flash of lightning, a loud clap of thunder, and a quick but definite cloudburst. "It's Sam Bellamy," said a crew member. "The pirates don't want to be found," said Stretch. This artifact represented a new beginning for us. From now on, we knew that we were digging in the right area and could actually start finding the things we had come for. Despite the lack of money from investors, we couldn't stop. Lazier loaned more money to the project and we kept digging. As we kept digging, we found thousands of artifacts, including cannonballs, pewter plates, forks, and shot, grape-sized pieces of lead meant to be fired from swivel guns mounted on the stern section of the ship. Every hole we dug with the mailboxes contained a bonanza of historical artifacts. And then, of course, there was the gold and silver. It seemed to be everywhere. John Byers brought up the first dive bag full of silver coins. When he brought them on deck, we all just stared at them. "They look like seashells," said Stretch. "Yeah," said Murphy, "but they clink like silver." I picked one of them up and rubbed it until the Spanish cross appeared. Clear proof that we had pieces of 8. There's a lot more where those came from, said Byers. He was right. At one time, I had found 280 coins in just 20 minutes in a very small crevice in the clay. The gold artifacts emerged from the depths looking the same as they had the day they had spilled into the sea. There were several escudos, tiny gold pieces used by the Spanish that came up looking bright and shiny. Then, of course, there were the gold bars. They appeared in various sizes and shapes, looking as if they had been poured into ingots and dropped into the sea only the day before. One day, Murphy came up with a sandwich bag he had partially filled with the dull glitter of gold. It was our guess that the Whydah was carrying bags of gold dust along with the coins and ingots of silver and gold. These were shuffled under the sand like all the other heavy artifacts. When the bags disintegrated, the dust had been held there, spreading throughout the sand and even sinking down into the clay subsurface. Now it seemed to be everywhere. We found several cannons, their iron bodies so heavily encrusted that they looked like elongated boulders. Although the gold and silver was foremost in everyone's mind, I made it clear from the beginning that all the artifacts were important. Iron and gold get the same treatment, I told a reporter, explaining the difference between a treasure hunter and an archaeologist. I had been adamant from the beginning about my goals. I wanted to conserve the artifacts and display them in a pirate museum. Given that this was, and remains, the only pirate ship ever found, I felt that the best way to understand this mysterious subculture would be to put all the artifacts on display so the full presence of their history could be felt. I was not a treasure hunter, although I was obviously hunting for treasure. I thought of myself as a history hunter, an undersea salver with a driving interest in bringing a great historic period back to life in a responsible way that a working man could appreciate, as well as a historian. Surprisingly, my ringing endorsement for preservation did not win me friends in the archaeological community. They didn't like the notion of a private individual launching an archaeological project in the first place. Now that I was declaring myself one of them, they liked the Whydah project even less. At the next meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, it was obvious that I was going to be held to even stricter preservation standards. Dr. Paul Johnson agreed to let the meeting be held at the Peabody Museum in Salem, where he was curator. Johnson had been one of the academic archaeologists who didn't mind speaking out publicly about the Whydah project. Before I started the search, he told the press that the Whydah never existed, that it was only a myth. Now that the artifacts had been found, he was the first with credentials to tell the press that there was no proof that I had found the Whydah. I was stunned. I looked at my friend Robert Cahill, one of the board members, but he would not make eye contact with me. In the newspapers, he had made the remarkable statement that if anyone, after seeing this stuff, still has doubt that this is indeed the Whydah, I don't know what would convince them. It was only later that I had learned that Cahill had been reprimanded by his fellow board members for declaring we had found the Whydah. "There's no doubt you found an important wreck, which well might be the Whydah," said Cahill, choosing his words carefully. "Some of us, though, feel we should wait for further evidence before making formal recognition." That area of the Cape has one of the highest density of shipwrecks of any place on the East Coast, declared another board member. There are hundreds of wrecks out there. There had clearly been disagreement on the board about what proof they should require. Some, like Cahill, knew the area and were aware that the objects we had found could only be from the Whydah. Others wanted written proof. One of the board members, I discovered later, had declared only a quarterboard that says Whydah would make me believe these guys. I knew I had the Whydah, and frankly, I didn't care what the board members thought. Their next bit of news hit me like a load of bricks. "The only way to answer this doubt satisfactorily," said another board member, Joseph Sennett, "is to conduct a full archaeological examination of the site before another coin is disturbed. Such an examination is the responsibility of maritime explorations." Suddenly I was reduced to desperation. A full archaeological site examination is an expensive procedure, and I had barely enough money to pay for the essentials for the next 2 weeks. "What are we going to do?" I asked Lazier. "There's nothing we can do except what the board tells us to do," said Lazier. "They are controlling the site permits." I realized that, but a survey would put a dent in the best financed operation, I said, and we don't have any money. I guess I'll have to spring for it, said Lazier. Frankly, if we don't do it, the project is probably dead. Lazier agreed to write a check for $50,000, which would cover operations for the rest of the summer, including the cost of the survey. Then he went searching for additional financing. Of course, the savvy members of the board knew that forcing us to conduct the survey would be a major hurdle to our economically strapped operation. With Lazier's financial rescue, however, we decided to conduct the best survey we could. We eventually hired a company called Maritime Archaeological and Historical Research Institute. A demonstration of a newly developed method of survey sufficiently impressed the board. We were allowed to get on with the excavation, and despite the holdups and the expenditure, it proved to be an amazingly fruitful season. We recovered 12,107 artifacts that season and 7,309 the next, for a total of 19,416 artifacts. Lazier found more financing through a Minnesota investment lawyer who put together a private stock offering that raised nearly $1 million. This continued to underwrite the operation and allowed us to rent a large warehouse that we converted into a laboratory. There, newly hired conservators faced the daunting task of restoring the heavily concreted artifacts to something close to the luster they had in 1717. With the exception of silver, gold, and lead, which suffer very little from hundreds of years underwater, all the objects we find are permeated with the corrosive salts of seawater. Most of them, especially iron, are caked with a concrete-like covering of salts and other minerals that have to be neutralized. This is done by placing the objects in a tank of fresh water wired with DC current, and functions like electroplating in reverse. Eventually, meaning weeks or years, the incrustation, with the help of the conservator, is able to be chipped away to reveal the object underneath. To equip the lab cost more than $250,000. This included office space, a variety of electrified tanks ranging from those small enough for pistols to others large enough for cannons and anchors, an intricate water system, an electrical system, plus all the cameras, drafting tables, and specialized tools. Even though we now had a considerable amount of money in our coffers, we were spending it very rapidly on careful excavation and diligent conservation efforts. Yet, already one of our archaeologists had been refused the opportunity to present a paper at the Society of Historical Archaeology on the grounds that no paper that results from or reports on treasure hunting could be given. Although we were doing responsible archaeology, and I had the bills and results to prove it, we were still recognized as thieves of history by the academic archaeologists. It did not seem fair to me, but that's the way it was. 1985 was a good year for archaeological finds, but perhaps the greatest treasure that year came in human form with the arrival of Ken Kincor. Kincor was a historian, a piratologist to be exact. His career path was chosen when, as a child, he had finished reading Treasure Island and wished that the book was infinitely longer. He went on to read nearly everything written on pirates, including a lot of primary source material like the depositions of merchant captains captured by pirates and military accounts of encounters with buccaneers. One of the most important areas of research for Kincor was the dicey subject of the pirate crew's racial mix. Black activists in the Boston area were upset that so much had been made of the Whydah, especially since she had been a slave ship. Most vocal was State Representative Byron Rushing, who for 10 years had directed Boston's Museum of African American History. I think you should tell the story of black people in New England, but I'm not sure if I would start with gangsters, which is what pirates were, he said after one of the public forums at which we presented the history of the Whydah and our goal of building a museum. To me, that's like telling the history of blacks in the 1990s and starting with drug dealers. Sure, it's part of the story, but it's not everything, and it's not where you start. Kincor felt differently from Rushing about the pirates and the meaning of what they did. Many would see the pirates as scoundrels, pure and simple, said Kincor. I take a different approach. If we look at the pattern of European society of the period, we are compelled to conclude that these men were not simple robbers. Rather, they were acting against social grievances. By studying the historical record, Kincor found that as many as 25% of Bellamy's crew was black. Further research revealed that as many as 30% of all pirates during the years 1715 to 1725 were of African origin. The reason, he felt, were that escaped slaves could be counted on to fight to keep their freedom. He even found 2 entirely black crews, with the exception of a single white man apiece. Piratical racial tolerance did not proceed from an idealistic version of the fundamental brotherhood of man, wrote Kincor in a major paper in American Visions magazine entitled Black Men Under the Black Flag. Instead, it sprang from a spirit of revolt against political and economic and social oppression. The shared experience of oppression was thus a solvent that broke down the social barriers within a pirate crew. Shared feelings of marginality meant that the primary allegiance of pirates was given to their brethren. Kincor continued, "It is hardly surprising that so many blacks, confronted with far worse prospects by staying put within the European or American social order, chose piracy." Whether by accident or intention, somewhere near Cuba, Bellamy and his men met up with Benjamin Hornigold, the famed buccaneer. He operated out of New Providence in the Bahamas and trained many pirates from his base of operations. Hornigold developed pirates because he needed as many able-bodied seamen as he could get to pounce on a profusion of targets. Perhaps Hornigold's best-known pupil was Edward Blackbeard Teach, known for boarding pirate merchant ships with sizzling matches in his hair and beard to appear especially fierce to the prospective targets. A dangerous drunkard, Blackbeard impressed patrons in New Providence bars by floating gunpowder on his rum, setting it on fire, and drinking the flaming concoction. Hornigold promoted his prize pupil as quickly as he could, putting him in charge of a sloop that had been captured in a savage battle. Hornigold was still searching for pirate talent when he met Sam Bellamy. He liked this enterprising young man and the crew that loyally followed him. Hornigold increased his flotilla by giving Bellamy's company the Mary Ann, a New England-built sloop. The crew gathered on the deck and unanimously re-elected Bellamy as their captain. With Hornigold and Blackbeard to back him up from the sea, Bellamy took the Mary Ann on a successful raid into Cuba's Portobello harbor. Returning to Hornigold's flotilla, Bellamy found that his fellow pirates had stopped a ship loaded with logwood and were arguing whether the ship should be plundered or not. Although the wood carrier was Dutch-owned, her captain was English, which raised an interesting issue, since Hornigold would never attack an English ship. Finally, the pirates agreed that the ship's nationality mattered more than the captain's, and the ship was plundered. When the crew of the captured ship was offered a chance to turn pirate, a young man, possibly of African origin, named John Brown stepped forward and was taken on by Bellamy's crew. A few days later, 2 cocoa-carrying brigantines were stopped by Bellamy on their way to Veracruz, Mexico. After the pirates looted the ships, their crews were offered a chance to go on the account. Hendrik Quintor, a seaman of African ancestry who had been born in Amsterdam, joined Bellamy's crew. The Bellamy gang continued a life of easy plunder. In June 1716, they captured an English ship captained by John Brett. Since the ship was English, Hornigold wouldn't allow her cargo to be taken, but the pirates did plunder the liquor before setting the ship free. After that interlude, the pirates stopped some slow cargo haulers called pinks off the coast of Cuba and robbed them. 4 of their crewmen joined the pirates. Then Bellamy sailed to Samana Bay on the coast of Cuba, where the pirates careened their ships, beaching the vessels and turning them on their sides so that they could scrape the marine life off the hulls and cover them with a protective layer of tar. While the ships were being careened, a serious dispute broke out among the pirates. Some of the men were angry at Hornigold over his refusal to plunder British ships. He did have defenders. Some English-born pirates sympathized with Hornigold's loyalty to England. Many of the pirates were not English, and they saw no reason to spare His Majesty's ships over those of Spain and France. Business is business, they argued, and the business of piracy sees no flag as a barrier to plunder. It is clear that Bellamy was a strong proponent of free plunder and that Blackbeard leaned in that direction. Hornigold and Bellamy heatedly debated the issue for several days while the seamen acted as active spectators, offering their opinions at every opportunity. In keeping with the articles that governed them, the crew took a vote and chose Bellamy to replace Hornigold as captain of the pirate fleet. Hornigold was allowed to keep his share of the loot, as were the men who decided to join him. Among that group of about 24 men was Blackbeard. Although he sympathized with the men who left Hornigold, Blackbeard had decided to stay with his captain out of loyalty. The Hornigold gang was given a sloop and all provisions needed to reach safe harbor. Bellamy's democratic election to the office of captain was a leap forward for his career. At the same time, new officers were elected for his ship, the Mary Ann, including newcomer John Fletcher as quartermaster, William Maine as sailing master, and Jeremiah Burke as boatswain. A second sloop joined them as well, La Postillon, captained by French pirate Oliver Levasseur, known as La Buse, the Vulture. This ship and its captain had served under Hornigold for several months. Like-minded in their desire to ravage shipping, the tiny flotilla sailed into the blue Caribbean, its men, the masters of their universe. Toward the end of summer, we blew a pit about 40 feet south of where we found the first cannons. A large hit had been registered in this spot by the magnetometer, and we wanted to check it out before fall weather put an end to our season. McClung went down wearing the Aga full face mask so we could hear him over the communication system as he waited for the sand to settle and the pit to clear enough for him to see the source of the hit. "There's something huge down here, but I can't tell what it is," said McClung. "Maybe it's a rock, and you just don't recognize it," quipped Stretch. "I don't think so," insisted McClung. "I think it's a bell." McClung had a penchant for melodrama, so none of us got too excited. "I still can't tell what it is," said McClung. I told him to come back up, and when he did, Stretch started the engine and blew more prop wash down on the target. By the time he was finished, I had suited up and was in the water with McClung. We dropped down to the pit and waited for the sand to settle. When it did, I could see it clearly. A bell was sitting in the bottom of the pit. My heart began to trip. I settled down and tried to rub the side of it to see if there was a name etched into its side. The metal was heavily concreted, and I couldn't tell what ship it was from. "It's a bell, all right," I said when I got back to the surface. A few days later, on October 7th, we wrapped the bell in straps and pulled it from the bottom of the ocean. "It looks like the bell, all right," said Sembrola, a marine archaeologist. "It looks like it's 18th century. I can tell from its shape, but I don't know if it's from the Whydah." I tried not to think about the bell after that, but a day before Halloween, an archaeologist was able to reveal a piece of the bell with the word galley. "What does that mean?" I asked Carl Becker, the lab conservator. "It's probably galley without the E," he said. "It was spelled differently than it is now." By now a crowd had gathered, including McClung, Murphy, and Tuck Whitaker, an investor. We looked at it a while, and then I asked the question on everyone's mind. "Can you chip the rest of the concretion away?" "I suppose I could," said Becker, taking a close look at the surface. Everyone took a half breath as Becker lined up the chisel and gingerly tapped it several times with his hammer. Suddenly, a lump of concreted material slid away, and the blessed words we had been looking for were exposed. The Whydah Galley, 1716. We went wild with elation. In an instant, we had proof positive that we had indeed found the Whydah. And then we noticed something. Everyone had assumed that the ship's name was spelled with an I. But now we saw the true spelling was with a Y. "I guess I'll have to change all the stationery," said Murphy glibly. "Not to mention all the T-shirts and caps," I said. "Forget that stuff," said Tuck, smacking his chest. "I have to change my tattoo." We contacted everyone we could think of with the news, and virtually everyone came to see and record the discovery. Then, of course, there was the media. All the networks sent camera crews and newspapers sent their reporters. On November 1st, 1985, the New York Times ran a front-page article that showed the bell being brought up on board the Vast from the ocean's bottom. The headline read, "Bell confirms that salvors found pirate ship of legend." The article proclaimed the Whydah the object of debate, search, and wonder for 268 years, and declared the bell to be the first identification in history of a pirate ship. Then, in the midst of everything that was going on, Alan Tafanction won an astounding legal victory that gave us complete control of the Whydah, from site management to ownership of all the artifacts. Not only did this ruling by the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts take us out from under the thumb of the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, it also meant that we did not have to give 25% of our fine to the state of Massachusetts. In effect, this meant that we, as investors, owned every piece of coin, cannon, pistol, and fork that the ghost of Bellamy and his crew would give us. Life couldn't have been better. There was no stopping us now. Ravaging the Caribbean netted Bellamy and crew the booty from 52 ships and possibly more. Here is a partial list of the ships he claimed as his prizes. Unnamed ship, October 1716. After battling with the French man-of-war, the Mary Ann next appears on the north coast of the Dominican Republic, where the pirates captured a prison ship containing several men convicted of smuggling. Among the 7 men welcomed into the pirate fraternity are Simon Van Voorst of New York and Thomas Baker, a Dutch tailor. Bonetta, November 1716. Between St. Thomas and St. Croix, the Mary Ann and the Postilion unfurl their black flags with a death's head and bones across, according to her frightened captain, and rob the ship of her goods. The Pearl and the Sultana, December 1716. After capturing and looting a string of ships, Bellamy and Lebuse spotted a pair of ships off the coast of Guadeloupe. After looting the Pearl and forcing some of her crewmen to join his band of pirates, which is only done when the specific skills of a sailor are needed. The remaining crewmen from the Sultana were put onto the Pearl and dismissed. Bellamy then made the Sultana his flagship. He transferred his command to the newly acquired galley and lobbied to have his old friend, Palsgrave Williams, made temporary captain of the Mary Ann. The St. Michael, the next day. With luck on his side, Bellamy spotted the St. Michael about 60 miles from Saba. He seized the ship and relieved her of her cargo of prime Irish beef and other supplies. He also forced 4 of her seamen to join him, including Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter whose skills were needed on his ships. When he cried out he didn't want to become a pirate, one of Bellamy's men, with anti-royalty sentiments, shouted, "Damn him! He was a Presbyterian dog and should fight for King James." When he continued to put up a fuss, Bellamy promised to release him at a later date. By now, the ships under Bellamy's command were loaded with booty and manpower. He had approximately 180 men of all nationalities under his command, and a cargo as varied as the men who had stolen it. The pirates sailed westward, probably along the north shore of Hispaniola, toward the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti. They probably stopped briefly at Rio de la Plata on the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic, before shoving off again to see what they could see in the heavily traveled Windward Passage. It didn't take them long to find yet another prize. After a couple of days in stiff wind, they saw the mother of all prizes, a 300-ton galley, her sails filled with the wind that allowed her to ply her way northward. "Give chase," was Bellamy's command. The date was February 1717, and the chase would last 3 days. The ship they were chasing was the Whydah. The middle of Provincetown, the intersection of Commercial and Standish Streets, is marked by an enormous anchor netted accidentally by a fisherman. South of the anchor, jutting into the harbor, is McMillan Pier. At the end of this pier, Bob Lazier and I stood in 1995, admiring our new purchase, a 7,500-square-foot building that would become the new home of maritime exploration, and the first site of a museum dedicated solely to the display of Whydah artifacts. Such a museum had been long in the coming. Until this point, we had been exhibiting the Whydah artifacts at the Pilgrim and Provincetown Museum Monument in Provincetown. This exhibit was a means of keeping the Whydah and her artifacts in the public view and a source of revenue. Although the exhibit was professionally designed, it was not what I had in mind. It barely mentioned how we found the Whydah. There was not a word concerning the history of the pirates. The focus of the exhibit was on conservation, particularly how the individual artifacts were deconcreted with dental tools. The conservatives working on the deconcretion in public were not allowed to speak to the people coming through the exhibit. "That's okay," said Ken Kidcore, only partially joking. "After someone has been working on a concretion for 3 or 4 hours, they are in no condition to talk to anyone anyway." Now it was time for us to develop our own museum and tell the story as we saw fit. The first thing we did was gut the building, which had been a restaurant. With an empty space, we set about to design an exhibit with one focus: tell the story of the Whydah the way we saw it. We would tell the legend of Bellamy and my efforts to substantiate it. Then we would hit all the high points: the recovery and conservation of this historic treasure and what we have learned from it, the history of the pirates and piracy, their social structure, and, of course, the democratic precepts they lived under, including the fact that they were free to elect captains. Then there was the history of the Whydah herself before being captured by Bellamy and her intended purpose as a slaver. With that portion of the exhibit, we would show how the ship was designed to hold 600 captured Africans below her decks, shackled to the floor for weeks at a time on a rolling ship with no sanitation nor methods of getting exercise. Artifacts from this sad period in history included shackles that we had reproduced from concretion molds, replicas of a branding iron, and a necklace, a cumbersome device that ring the neck with iron bars to allow easy handling of unruly slaves. To illustrate the artistic grandeur of these victimized people, we planned to display the golden archon jewelry we had found, the oldest reliably dated examples of this type of jewelry. With our plans in place, we began designing the space and planning the exhibits themselves. Work like this never goes smoothly, and this was no exception. We had originally planned to open Memorial Day, but by mid-May it was clear we wouldn't make it. The floor was covered with rubble, the contractors were slow, and Ken and I were arguing with the designer about the form and content of the exhibits. We set our sights on a more reasonable deadline of July 4th, Independence Day. As another month passed, work on the museum seemed to slow even more. We pressed on. Finally, opening day arrived. On July 24th, exhausted, I opened the door and let the public in. The Expedition Whydah Sea Lab and Learning Center was now open for business. The reaction of the public was a tremendous reward for all of our efforts. All summer long, people streamed through the museum in awe of the living history we had compiled. Children touched the cannons and looked at the pictures and maps, while their parents read the exhibit narration and examined the detail on the artifacts. It was virtually impossible for me to walk through the museum without being stopped by visitors who wanted to know more about the various aspects of the expedition. It is still like that to this day. I began planning a maritime education and research center, an educational facility that would use the Whydah as an example of studying underwater archaeology and other aspects of the marine environment. It was a great idea, but one we could not afford to dwell on for very long. We were short-staffed at the museum, so Ken had to spend much of his time manning the cash register and giving tours of the exhibits. I had to attend to business, too. It was time to plan a whole new season. There was almost no opportunity for a new season, or any future seasons for that matter. Shortly after we closed the deal for the museum property at McMillan Pier, a heavy storm tore the Vast Explorer from her mooring and cast her on top of the stony breakwater at the mouth of Provincetown Harbor. The high seas would have pulled her toward open water if a sharp rock on the jetty hadn't spiked through a hull, pinning the Vast on this rocky crag. "Boats can't survive that," said a veteran fisherman when I arrived at the scene and saw my vessel high and dry. "I've seen this happen before," said another fisherman. "The waves eventually break it to pieces." "That's a dead boat," said another fisherman. "She's going to struggle for a while, but she's dead." I took over. With the help of the Coast Guard and friends, we prepared for high tides, at which point the Vast was guided off the stony breakwater and slid back into the ocean where she was safe. The grounding of the Vast was an inspirational incident for me. Just before the rescue of the Vast, I was spent. The work was extremely difficult and dangerous, and in no way routine. Whenever any of us relaxed on the site, something slapped us in the face. A rogue wave would sweep over the gunnels, flattening someone, a piece of equipment would break at a critical time, or we would find that we had wasted our time on a particular task, like digging all day to reach what we thought was a chest of gold, only to find a modern-day anchor. And when you are a one-horse operation with a few employees, your head is constantly buzzing with responsibility. The final report prepared by archaeologist Christopher Hamilton had given me a perfect out, if I was looking for one. The report declared that very little other significant shipwreck material existed in the main body of the site. In essence, it said that we had found everything worthwhile there was to find. I knew this wasn't true. I was 95% certain that we had brought up only a fraction of the artifacts and treasure, but that 5% of uncertainty weighed on me. What if there were really nothing else to be found? What if all the swivel guns and cannon and pieces of 8, and God knows what else, really had washed away over the years? That doubt, in combination with my case of burnout, made me wonder if I wanted to continue working the Whydah site. Seeing the Vast on the breakwater that day was a clarifying moment for me. I felt the sting of lost opportunity. If she sank, I knew that I would never know the full truth about the Whydah. On that day, I decided that the dig must go on. For that to happen, I needed multi-talented crew members. I had put feelers out for an experienced diver when a friend, John Baldwin, told me about a young man named Chris McCourt who worked at the Aries Pond Boatyard in Orleans. I hired Chris sight unseen on his birthday, June 12, 1997. We spent several weeks doing a facelift on the Vast. We sanded and painted her, the original classic white with red and black trim. Then we cleaned her out and did the same thing below decks. By the time we were ready to go back on site for the first time in 7 years, the Vast Explorer looked as good as the day we had found the Whydah, more than 10 years earlier. The 1997 season was a short and unproductive one. It wasn't that my expectations were high, they weren't. For one thing, I was rusty after not having dug on the site for so many years. But other things also conspired to keep this from being a fruitful season. In some areas where a mag had told us there was a large piece of metal, several feet of extra sand kept us from digging down to the hit. More than once, the weather worked against us, literally blowing us off the site. And of course, the same dumb luck that helps you find things sometimes keeps you from finding things as well. So it was in 1997. In the last few weeks of the season, we tallied up the artifacts we had found. So few were our finds that I was beginning to believe, as Hamilton's final report had stated, that the site had been emptied of artifacts and that we had found everything that there was to find. The possibility that the Whydah site might be tapped out weighed heavily on my shoulders for the next 8 months. The two galleys were matching speeds, though the Sultana was having trouble catching the Whydah. The crew of the Sultana had hoped that the captain of the other ship would not notice them on his tail, or would perhaps slow to see if the ship behind him was a vessel he wanted to convoy with. But the Whydah heeled to and sailed hard, and Bellamy and his crew had no choice but to sail hard too. With Williams behind him in the Mary Ann, Bellamy pursued the rapidly fading ship. At one point, Bellamy's pirates lost sight of the three-masted galley and nearly gave up the chase. Bellamy guessed the course, and soon the sails were visible again above the horizon. The next day, the Sultana pulled within cannon shot of the Whydah. "Load and fire," ordered Bellamy, and his men did just that, firing 2 cannon rounds across the bow of the Whydah. This was a defining moment in the chase. The Whydah had 18 guns, and with 50 able-bodied seamen, its crew could have put up a savage battle against the attacking pirates. But the captain of the Whydah knew not to fire a gun in self-defense. Lawrence Prince was no newcomer to the ways of pirates. He had seen many things in his 30 years at sea, and no doubt knew that he was defenseless despite his armament. With a heavy heart, he lowered his sails and stood ready to receive the boarding party of pirates. Prince had been a Royal Naval officer early in his career, and then went on to become a trader on the west coast of Africa. For at least 13 years he had sailed cargo from London to Africa, where he traded goods to African kings for the slaves they captured. There were no slaves on board when Bellamy's boarding party set foot on the decks of the Whydah. Prince had already sold his cargo somewhere in the Caribbean basin and was now completing the homeward leg of his journey. When Bellamy's men searched below decks, they found the compartment stuffed with valuable cargo. To the displeasure of Captain Prince, Bellamy's men looked further, exclaiming joyfully as they found precious sacks of gold and silver. Veteran pirate Peter Hoof later testified, "The money taken in the Whydah, which was reported to amount to 20 or 30,000 pounds sterling, was counted over in the cabin and put up in bags. 50 pounds to every man's share, there being 180 men on board." It is even rumored that a casket of East Indian jewels was aboard, its contents including a ruby the size of a hen's egg. It was agreed among the pirates to head north. The pirates transferred their booty from the Sultana to the Whydah. They brought over 10 cannons they had taken from other ships and mounted them on the deck of the Whydah, giving her the firepower of a fifth-rate man-of-war. They also picked up as many as 10 new pirates from Prince's crew. About a half-dozen joined voluntarily, and 3 more who were forced because the pirates needed their special skills. This is where Davis, the forced carpenter from an earlier conquest, took this opportunity to petition Bellamy for release. Bellamy was willing to let the unhappy crew member leave with Prince, but the other pirates rejected the proposal. "No, damn him," one of the pirates shouted. "We would rather shoot him or whip him at the mast than let him leave." He stayed. Prince and his remaining crew were given the Sultana and a small quantity of supplies with which to make it to the next port. As a parting gesture, Bellamy gave the angry slave ship captain a donation of 20 pounds sterling. Loaded to the gunwales with cargo and more than 180 men, Bellamy continued his plunder of the Caribbean basin before heading north. By now, his multinational crew of renegades were calling themselves Robin Hood's men, and they were conducting themselves accordingly. Off Pettigrove, near Haiti, they took the Tana frigate, a Jamaican vessel chartered by French merchants to sail to Rochelle, France, with a cargo of sugar, indigo, and about 5,000 livres in French money. They helped themselves to the silver and pressed on. 120 miles from South Carolina, the Bellamy flotilla spotted a sloop commanded by Captain Beer. After plundering this man's ship, Bellamy offered to let him leave. Bellamy's crew saw things differently. "What if he reports us to the authorities?" they asked. The crew voted to sink his boat and to keep him prisoner on Williams's boat, the Mary Ann. Beer was shocked by what he saw, a ship run so democratically that members of her crew could vote to override the wishes of the captain. Courageously, given the position he was in, he poked Bellamy with a question. "Have you no control over your men, or do they control you?" The question ignited Bellamy's deepest feelings in a heartfelt speech about who pirates were and what they stood for. "Damn my blood," said Bellamy, "I am sorry they won't let you have your sloop again, for I scorn to do any mischief when it is not for my advantage. Damn the sloop, we must sink her, and she might be of use to you, though, damn you, you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all of those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who hath 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field. And this my conscience tells me. But there is no arguing with such sniveling puppies who allow superiors to kick them about the deck at pleasure, and pin their faith upon a pimp of a parson, a squab who neither practices nor believes what he puts on the chuckle-headed fools he preaches to." Captain Beer and his crew were taken, then transferred to the Mary Ann, and his ship sunk. He was later released unharmed at Block Island when William stopped to visit his mother and sisters. Bellamy and crew loaded more ships as they rode a southwest wind towards Cape Cod. At 9 in the morning on April 26, 1717, a Dublin merchant ship, coincidentally also called the Mary Ann, came into view between Nantucket and George's Bank. Without hesitation, Bellamy brought his ship quickly alongside and ordered the captain to strike his colors. The captain of the ship, Andrew Crumstay, immediately did as told. Bellamy put a rowboat over and sent 7 armed pirates to his new prize. In charge of the boarding party was Thomas Baker, the former tailor from Holland. His second in command was a tough-talking Jamaican named John Brown, who armed himself with pistols and a sword in order to make a strong first impression. Another tough was John Schwan, who went to the prize ship with no weapons whatsoever. Thomas South, a forced man from a ship taken earlier, was a timid member of this boarding party. He made it immediately clear to the captured sailors that he was not a pirate and had no desire to become one. Captain Crumstay and 5 of his crewmen were taken at sword point to the Whydah with the ship's papers, leaving only 3 of his men on board to stand a futile watch over their cargo, which the boarding party was now in the joyous process of discovering. The Mary Ann's manifest revealed that she was laden with more than 7,000 gallons of Madeira wine, a revelation that must have inspired shouts of elation when Bellamy read the ship's papers out loud. As Crumstay watched in anger, Bellamy ordered his crew on the Mary Ann to follow him in a north-by-northwest course toward Cape Cod. Bellamy's decision to steer directly for the Cape is a mystery that can only be explained by the fact that he was planning to stop at one of the Cape towns, probably Provincetown. There is little question in my mind that Bellamy planned to accomplish 2 tasks with one stop, picking up Maria Hallett in Eastham and selling smuggled goods at Great Island Tavern. If Bellamy didn't have such a plan, and he were planning to proceed directly to Maine, He would have avoided the treacherous waters of Cape Cod. But he did not do that. There were at least 150 men sailing on the Whydah, and it is a safe bet that most of them were above deck, since the below decks were jammed with goods and booty. And they must have been a happy crew on this April day, knowing that they were masters of a ship filled with cargo that would make them all rich men. Elephant tusks, sugar, molasses, rum, livestock, cloth, quinine bark, indigo, and tons of dry goods could easily be sold in the colonies. Then there was the precious metal, 180 sacks of coin, each weighing 50 pounds. It is no wonder that the ship sat low in the water, wallowing under the weight of its own wealth. Right now the weather was fine. The wind was still coming from the southwest and off the land, carrying with it the smell of the spring's earth and bloom. Months at sea had left the crew craving the feel of firmness under their feet. The heavenly smell of the wind that pushed their ship conjured dreams of the bounty that Mother Earth held for them. In a few more hours, they would touch that earth again. "Fog!" came the shout from a lookout. Ahead, near what is now Chatham, a bank of gray clouds could be seen rolling across the water. This was not a good sign. The fog not only limited visibility, it also indicated that the warm air that had been pushing them had wedged into a bank of cold air, possibly signifying a worsening of weather. Bellamy headed the Whydah into the wind so that he could loosen her sails. Without a local pilot to guide the way, it was dangerous to proceed in such a fog. Bellamy decided to stay put until the weather announced its intentions. Within half an hour, a small sloop emerged from the fog. As the boat approached, the Whydah crew could see that her name was the Fisher, and that she was slowing down at the sight of the former slave ship. "Do you know these waters?" shouted Bellamy. "We do," replied Robert Ingalls, who told Bellamy that he was a coastal trader who had plied these waters many times. "Then we need you," shouted Bellamy, and he sent 4 pirates to capture the Fisher. It was Bellamy's plan to use Ingalls and his mate as pilots to navigate these treacherous waters. At about 5 p.m., the situation worsened. Fog increased, and Bellamy ordered all 3 ships to hang lanterns from the yardarms to avoid losing each other in the growing darkness. The Mary Ann took the lead, followed by the Whydah, and then by the tiny Fisher. The Mary Ann soon fell out of formation and began to lag behind. "Make haste," shouted Bellamy to the crew of the Mary Ann. "Aye, Captain," shouted John Brown, a little too enthusiastically. "I will carry the sail until she carries her masts away." Brown's problem was that he was raving drunk, as were all the other pirates on board the wine ship. They had all been liberally sampling the ship's cargo and were threatening the crewmen of the Mary Ann as they gulped down the smooth Madeira wine. At one point, running low on wine, Van Voorst, the pirate, told one of the crewmen that he would break his neck if he could not find more alcohol. The same crewman, Alexander McConaughey, was then threatened by John Brown, who, according to later legal depositions, growled that, for a small matter, he would shoot McConaughey through the head as soon as he would a dog, and that he should never tell his story to anyone if he was allowed to survive by the pirates. There was a growing question as to whether any of them would survive, for it was becoming obvious that this was no ordinary fog. An Arctic storm from Canada was driving into the warm air that had swept up the coast from the Caribbean. The last gasp of frigid New England winter, the cold front was about to combine with the warm front in one of the worst storms ever to hit Cape Cod. As the wind shifted, the smell of air changed. The sweet odor of loamy earth was replaced by the fish scent of salty spray. Then came the nerve-wracking swells and the whitecaps as the North Atlantic surged with the wind. Many of the old salts and the crew began to sweat despite the cold. They knew that the strong winds from the east were dangerous when off the Cape, and that skeletons of ships that had tried to make it and failed lined this shoreline. An added horror was the approaching darkness. They were surrounded by ghostly sounds of the rising wind and the swirling stew of fog and rain that was thickening by the minute and driving them toward that dreaded hook of land. The first to run aground was the Mary Ann. Her drunken and exhausted crew had lost sight of the Whydah and drifted toward shore. Following blindly was the Fisher, whose crew had also lost sight of the Whydah and decided to follow the Mary Ann. Although the sailors on each ship did not see the breakers until they were in them, they at least had the presence of mind to drop anchor, which kept them from hitting the shore with hull-crushing force. Both ships rode out the storm with relatively little damage. The Whydah was not as lucky as its two consorts. Bellamy continued to battle the storm northward, largely because he had no choice. Galleys handle poorly in high winds, and the rising gale coming from the northeast made it virtually impossible for the ship to tack out to sea. His only realistic strategy was to try to head north and hope the storm would diminish in strength. The strong winds from the sea made a northerly course impossible. With every lunge forward, the Whydah would lurch towards the west, pushed by winds that may have exceeded 70 miles an hour. "Breakers! Breakers!" shouted a lookout at the rail who could hear, but not see, the crashing waves. In a split second, the deck became an anthill of chaos. The helmsman was joined by another crewman. Together they pulled on the wheel hard and tried to change the ship's direction. Sailors climbed the foremast and struggled to trim the sails, while deckhands grabbed loose lines and secured them to the stays, since a line swinging in a gale is a deadly weapon. For a few moments, they thought their hard work had turned them out to sea. Then, through the howl of the storm, someone heard the waves crashing on the shoreline, and the cry, "Breakers! Breakers!" went up again. A real fear swept over the pirate crew. With a deep knowledge of the sea and the will to survive, those who hadn't taken to the bottle began to act on their own, as they had in so many other desperate situations. "Let go the main anchor!" shouted Bellamy. The pirates knew that this desperate measure, called club hauling, was meant to turn the ship around so she could face the waves and avoid being capsized. It was a last-ditch effort. The Whydah began to slowly turn toward the wind, taking thousands of tons of water over the gunwales as she was swept by 40-foot waves. Many of the 148 men on board must have been swept over the side at this point. Still the ship turned. As she did, there must have been hope among those still on board that they could face into the storm all night and somehow survive until morning. Then came that fateful bump. She had run aground and could turn no more. More water swept over the deck, filling the holes and slowly rolling the ship. Within 15 minutes of striking land, the mainmast was snapped off and floating free. Then, with nothing left to keep her upright, the ship began to roll upside down. Pirates were crushed as cannons and goods stored below came crashing through the decks. Those who could swam, but in water so cold there were few who could make it the 500 feet to shore. The ones who did froze to death trying to climb the steep sand cliffs of Eastham. In a moment, 144 pirates were dead or missing. Only 2 from the Whydah were thought to have survived that night. It was here, virtually at Maria Hallett's doorstep, that the Whydah crashed that perilous night. What did she see? If she were there, as all the legends say she was, she arose that morning to a scene of incredible carnage. Perhaps she stood on the cliffs and looked down at the dozens of sailors who had been swept ashore and were now floating like rag dolls in the frothy surf. Perhaps she found his body and mourned her horrible fate, the loss of a triumphant husband preceded by death of an infant son. Some say she did and went mad, spending days sowing blossoms from an apple tree where she met young Bellamy on a hyacinth blue dress. According to the legend, she put on the dress, slit her own throat, and jumped off the edge of the sand cliffs. So the legend goes. On July 7th, 1998, after waiting out a week of storms, we shoved off in the vast Explorer. Many of the usual crew members were working other jobs, leaving us greatly undermanned. Still, I was thankful for the crew I had. In addition to Chris, I had Catherine Harker, an assistant archaeologist with a wry Scottish wit, and Stretch Gray back aboard as captain, giving the vast Explorer an air of calm and good humor. Also joining us were my co-author, Paul Perry, and his 14-year-old son, Ben. A week in port had resulted in an interesting find on our computerized treasure map. By comparing site maps from past digs, Catherine had discovered that the area we were going to dig in was virgin territory. Over the years we had dug all around it, but had never blown a hole within this area. Our mag readings for this area showed some heavy hits. I tried not to get too excited by this kind of information, but it was difficult. From past experience, I knew it could be something that had nothing at all to do with the Whydah, possibly being an old Buick, as Stretch suggested. We arrived at the site and anchored. As Catherine shutted out coordinates, Stretch adjusted the length of anchor cables with the hydraulic winches and fine-tuned our position. Within 30 minutes of tying up, we were over one of the most promising mag readings, a large hit that could well be a cannon. We dropped the mailboxes with a thunderous splash, and Chris dove in to secure them in place. Then, with Chris safely out of the water, Stretch engaged the engines, and the prop wash was directed straight down to dig a pit in the sandy bottom. The powerful stream of water causes a yellowish sand to roll to the surface, where the tide carries it away from the boat. The sand comes up in a golden pudding until the prop wash finally digs through the sand and makes a pit until it reaches the substrata. Then there is a change in color once we hit clay. July 7th, 1998 was the beginning of one of the best seasons we ever had. The first hole rendered 2 pieces of 8 and signs of gold dust, which settled in between the rocks embedded within the clay subsurface. Then Catherine said that a very large hit had been made about 60 feet to the south by the magnetometer. Following that lead, we laid out the stern anchor cables, pulled in the bow cable, and positioned directly over the coordinate indicated on Catherine's laptop. The process of blowing a hole started all over again. Stretch slowly throttled the engines, and the prop wash began to kick up sand underneath us. First came the golden road of sand that was carried away by the running tide. Then came the faint red of the clay bottom, rising and drifting away with the gold. With the engine shut off, Chris put on his face mask and fins and went down to examine the spot that had registered so hot with the magnetometer. Attached to us by an air hose and a 2-way radio, Chris could give us an eyewitness account of what was happening below the surface. "I'm at the top of the pit," he said, stopping at the top of the cone-shaped hole that had been dug by the prop wash. He gave his depth, tested his breathing equipment, and then went to the bottom of the pit. "Unbelievable," he shouted excitedly. "I have a grinding stone. It is about 2.5 feet in diameter and approximately 6 inches thick. The center hole is cut square, and there is a groove around the circumference." A find like this is made more amazing by the fact that a grindstone contains no metal and does not register on a magnetometer. It was pure happenstance to find an object like this, and it told me that we were in an area of the site that was so rich with artifacts that we would find many that were unexpected. Chris continued to search the bottom of the pit and found the source of the mag hit, a 3.5-foot-long cannon that was covered in concretion. Armament of this size was a swivel cannon, a small anti-personnel weapon usually mounted on the quarter rail in the aft of the ship. "If it's a swivel cannon, then it's a whole new world down there," said Stretch, who knew that the aft portion of the ship was likely to house the bulk of the treasure. "Keep looking," he shouted to Chris over the radio. "The riches with the guns will be buried in the sand." On October 18, 1717, the 7 captured survivors of the Whydah disaster and the crash of the Mary Ann stood at a bar of a Boston courtroom. They had been in jail for nearly 7 months now and were wearing the same clothing they had on when the sea regurgitated them onto the shore. Suddenly being thrown into the limelight had unnerved them so much that they stood fidgeting nervously. In front of them sat the 13 men who would decide their fate, an illustrious group of high officials specially appointed to try, hear, and adjudge cases of piracy, robbery, and felony committed on the high seas. When it was time for the indictment against the pirates to be read, the sheriff of Suffolk County had the prisoners stand. With rapt attention, they listened as Mr. Smith, His Majesty's advocate, read the lengthy indictment. "Albeit the crimes of piracy and robbery are most odious and detestable, being repugnant to the laws of Almighty God, destructive of government, and directly tending to subvert and extinguish the natural and civil rights of mankind, so it is that the said Simon Van Vorst, John Brown, Thomas South, Thomas Baker, Hendrick Quinter, Peter Cornelius Hoof, and John Schwan, to the high displeasure of Almighty God, in open violation of the rights of nations and mankind, and in contempt of His Majesty's good and wholesome laws, aforesaid, willfully, wickedly, and feloniously, all and each of them, being principal actors and contrivers, associates, confederates, and accomplices, did, perpetrated, and committed on the high seas sundry acts of piracy. And so it went. One by one, witnesses for the king were brought into court to provide damning evidence against the defendants. Thomas Fitzgerald, first mate under Captain Andrew Crumstay on the Mary Ann, when she was captured by the Whydah, testified that all the 7 prisoners had boarded his ship armed with muskets, pistols, and cutlasses, except Thomas South and John Schwan. James Donovan, a crewman aboard the Mary Ann and brother-in-law to Andrew Crumstay, testified that the prisoners at the bar drank plentifully of the wines on board, but that Thomas South was civil and peaceable. Alexander McConaughey, the cook of the Mary Ann, testified that all the pirates who boarded his ship were armed except for Thomas South and John Schwan. All of them, said the cook, made all imaginable speed in order to escape from the hands of justice when the ship ran aground. Court was adjourned until 3 in the afternoon to give the accused pirates time to prepare their defense. I don't know what went on as they gathered together to consider their fates, but I do know that their options for alibi were very slim. All of them had been seen in the company of Bellamy's pirates. Their roles in the taking of the Mary Ann were now a matter of record. And for the most part, they all seemed to be willing participants in the taking of a ship on the high seas. They must have considered all these points as they pondered their defense. By the end of their preparation time, they all agreed to the only defense that could possibly save their lives. They had been forced to become pirates. One by one, they took the stand to declare that they were forced men. Yet, there are few direct quotes attributed to the accused pirates. Most of what they say is paraphrased. On the other hand, the prosecutor is quoted directly throughout the court records, perhaps because of his eloquence, but most likely because the pirates had no chance to win acquittal. The effort had not been made to quote them with accuracy. It was clear that the state did not care whether the defendants had been forced to serve as pirates or not. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Smith moved for the death penalty. Their pretense of being forced out of the respective ships and vessels they belonged to, if it was true, can never excuse their guilt, insisted Smith, since no case of necessity can justify a direct violation of the divine and moral law and give one the liberty of sinning. Only Thomas South escaped the noose, because the court felt that he had been taken from on board a Jamaican vessel and compelled entirely against his will to join the pirates. The 6 found guilty were returned to the Boston jail after hearing their death sentence read aloud, that you shall go hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence you shall be carried to the place of execution, and there you, and each of you, shall be hanged up by the neck until you, and each of you, are dead. And the Lord have mercy on your souls. On July 19, 1998, we discovered a wooden structure, possibly part of the Whydah. In all the years I had been digging on the site, discovering the actual vessel that held Bellamy and his crew ranks as the most exciting of all finds. That we found such a perishable artifact as a piece of the ship itself shows that destiny, and perhaps even the pirates, were on our side. Not to mention, of course, hard work and a tremendous amount of luck. Chris had gotten down into a newly blown hole, and we all listened to the communication system that turned each dive into a radio program. I'm at 32 feet, Chris said. There was a long pause and some stumbling with words before he spoke again clearly. I've got wood! I've got wood! It took a few moments for Chris to calm down. When he did, the image that emerged was of a long section of the ship with some of the decking still intact. A portion of the structure was lined with a well-manufactured piece of sheet metal, a detail of construction that was a mystery to us. Why would an interior section of a ship be lined with metal? The youngest crew member, Ben Perry, answered that question. He had been reading a book on ship's architecture and noticed that the powder room of many sailing vessels was often lined with tin or lead or other types of metal to keep the room dry and prevent dangerous sparking. The portion of the ship we had found was probably the powder room, which was near the captain's quarters. "It's Bellamy's captain," shouted Stretch. I now began to put it all together in my head. Many of the artifacts we found, the swivel gun, the cannons, the coins, and the trail of gold dust that we had been following, were leading to the aft section of the ship. We were excited but restrained, knowing that such a find would be unimaginably fortuitous, yet highly unlikely. After all, we were dealing with wood from a shipwreck nearly 300 years old. Was it possible that such a large piece of the ship could have survived intact and underwater? Our answer was standing on shore. While National Geographic photographers went over to get their shots, I noticed a man with a mirror flashing us from the beach. When I looked through the binoculars, I could see that the man was Bob Sambrola, a marine archaeologist who had worked with us in the past. I swam to our survey boat, the Crumstay, and took the boat into shore to meet him. By the time we got back to the Vast, he was fully briefed on what we had found. Within 5 minutes, he had a tank on and was in the water. Before I could suit up, he came back up carrying a fist-sized piece of precious structure, with an iron nail sticking out of it like a stem from an apple. "It's the sand," said Bob. "It's been covered with sand most of the years since it sank, and the sand keeps it from disintegrating." Once again, we were blessed by our major barrier, the ravenous sand. Without it, everything would have deteriorated or would have been swept away. With it, wooden hulls were preserved, and even gold dust was kept in place. We just had to contend with its seemingly eternal grip on objects, and to be thankful that it wasn't harder to get through than it was. I put on a tank and joined the other divers. Stretch had turned on the engines and blown a little more to clear the area, so by the time we arrived on the bottom, about 20 feet of wood was exposed. Rising out of the sand, the curved section of ship looked like it reached towards the surface. Smaller timbers at right angles from the structure showed us where the deck had been. On the inside of the hull, planks that were 4 inches wide and 2 inches thick created a bulkhead that was covered with a sheet of tin that was about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. Visibility was good, and I drew back for a moment to take in the whole scene. Although I had been elated on the surface, seeing the hull gave me a solemn feeling, the kind that Howard Carter must have felt when he had discovered the doorway to King Tut's tomb. This was a ship full of people sailing to safe harbor to share their bounty, I thought. Looking at the wooden structure that had been preserved in brine for 28 decades, this was where some of the most successful pirates of their time spent their final moments. This was their tomb. Chris later said that a calmness and goodness filled him as he pondered the meaning of the find. I agree with that assessment and have to say that I had a solemn feeling after seeing this portion of the Whydah, almost as though I had opened a door into a long-lost cathedral. Gradually, the tide stopped running and the sand began to settle over our find, erasing our excellent visibility. It was as though the pirates had given us a glimpse of the ship that we had looked for so long and were now putting it back to where it belonged. I looked at the wooden remnant one more time, wondering at the world of discovery that might lie underneath it. Were there coins, cannons, and gold bars under that waterlogged wood? Were there more bones concreted to iron objects? Maybe, I thought, as I drifted slowly to the surface. I would find out some other season. I turned my attention upward, feeling elated, yet melancholy as I swam toward the boat above. On the Vast Explorer there was jubilation as everyone realized the importance of the find. As we broke anchor and made for port, we began to ponder how the structure could be brought to the surface and preserved so others could see it. Stretch, whose mind is often active on such matters, offered a suggestion. Have an oil company erect a platform over it, clear the sand away, and put a platform on it and pull it up with a bunch of cranes. I shook my head. Whatever the final solution, it will take the kind of money only an oil company can muster to retrieve such a huge and ancient piece of the ship and restore the water-soaked wood. Even if we never bring the piece of the Whydah to the surface, there is a deep satisfaction in having discovered it. Finding this hull is like finding the soul of the ship, I said to Stretch on our way back to port. The search for all the missing pages in the Whydah's story will go on and on. I still believe that we've only found a small percentage of all the booty down there. In addition to the swivel cannons, muskets, swords, navigational instruments, and other 18th century nautical gear, there are thousands of coins, pounds of silver and gold, and perhaps even precious stones still to be found at the Whydah site. I know this is true because we found objects on nearly every dive all summer long. In reality, I don't know that we will ever find all those missing pages, or even if we will ever know what all the missing pages are. I do know, however, that I will keep searching for the Whydah clues for the rest of my life.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.